Chapter 1: The Blank Page. The air in the station was thick with the ghosts of 100 sleepless nights. It smelled of damp wool, bitter green tea, and the metallic tang of rain on the corrugated roof. Kenji Tanaka sat at the small communal table, meticulously cleaning the lens of a pair of high-powered binoculars. His movements were slow, deliberate, each wipe of the microfiber cloth a small ritual against the chaos that waited beyond the station's thin walls. Outside, the rain fell in a steady, percussive rhythm, a constant companion that did little to wash away the oppressive quiet of the Aokigahara. Haruto Ishikawa, the station chief, slammed a ceramic mug onto the counter. The dark liquid inside sloshed against the rim. He was a man carved from granite and impatience, his face a roadmap of scowls and windburn. He stared at the wall map, a sprawling topographical chart of the Jukai dotted with small, colored pins. Each pin was a closed case, a story ended. Red for recoveries, yellow for rescues. There were far more red pins than yellow. "It's the damp," Haruto grumbled, not to Kenji but to the room itself. "It gets into everything. The radios, the wood, your bones." Kenji gave a noncommittal grunt, his focus remaining on the lens. He polished it until the reflection of the room's single fluorescent light was a perfect, piercing star. He did not need to speak. He and Haruto had worked together for 7 years, and their communication had long since been stripped down to a series of grunts, sighs, and the occasional necessary sentence. Words were a currency best saved. In their line of work, you learn to ration everything: energy, hope, words. The phone rang. It was a shrill, ugly sound that cut through the rhythmic drumming of the rain. Neither man flinched. It was a sound as familiar as their own breathing. Haruto turned, snatching the receiver from its cradle before the second ring could finish. "Ishikawa." His voice was flat, devoid of surprise. He listened, his eyes flicking to the map tracing a sector in the northwest quadrant. "Campsite reported, 2 days old. A hiker stumbled on it this morning." He paused, listening again. "Understood." He hung up the phone with a decisive click. The room's quiet returned, now heavier, charged with purpose. "Kenji, Yumi, gear up." Haruto's voice was clipped. "Sector 47, near the ice caves. Someone's tent is still up." Yumi Sato emerged from the small communications room, pulling on her waterproof jacket. She was younger than Kenji by a decade, her movements sharp and efficient. She represented a new generation of rangers, one that put faith in GPS coordinates and thermal imaging drones. She glanced at Kenji, a silent question in her eyes. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The preparation was a silent, practiced dance. Boots were laced, packs were shouldered. Kenji slid the freshly cleaned binoculars into their padded case and clipped them to his chest harness. He checked the contents of his pack: first aid kit, high-energy rations, signal flares, a body bag. The final item was folded into a tight, compact square, its presence a grim, unspoken reality. The drive to the trailhead was 20 minutes of humming tires on wet asphalt and the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. No one spoke. Yumi monitored a tablet on her lap, its screen glowing with a satellite view of their target area. Haruto drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. his gaze fixed on the road that narrowed as the forest closed in around them. The Aokigahara did not welcome visitors. The trees grew thick and tangled, their roots twisting over volcanic rock in a dense, knotted carpet. They choked out the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. The ground was a soft, springy bed of moss and decaying leaves that muffled sound, swallowing footsteps and voices alike. It was a place designed for silence. Haruto pulled the truck to a stop at a small, muddy turnout marked with a faded wooden sign. The sign offered warnings and a phone number for a suicide prevention hotline. Its paint was peeling. The hiker's report puts the tent about a click and a half northwest of here, Yumi said, her voice a sharp contrast to the forest's oppressive hush. The terrain is uneven, lots of volcanic fissures. Stick to the compass, trust nothing else, Haruto ordered, his gaze sweeping over the impenetrable wall of green. GPS can get spotty under the canopy. Your eyes can lie to you in here. The compass doesn't. He fixed his stare on Kenji. You take point. Kenji nodded, swinging his pack onto his shoulders. He felt the familiar weight settle, a strange comfort in its burden. He stepped past the sign and into the trees. The air immediately grew colder, heavier. The sound of the rain on the truck's roof vanished, replaced by a soft, constant dripping from the dense canopy above. The world shrank to the small patch of ground in front of him and the trunks of the surrounding trees. He moved with a steady, ground-eating pace, his eyes scanning constantly. He noted the unnaturally uniform trunks of the cypress trees, the way the moss grew thickest on the north side, the subtle depressions in the ground that could indicate a hidden fissure. He was not looking for a person. Not yet. First, you looked for signs. A piece of discarded trash, a brightly colored scrap of clothing, a broken branch that was not bent by the wind. After an hour, Yumi, who was monitoring a small handheld device, stopped. Thermal picked up something. Faint. Could be residual heat from the body, she said, her tone clinical. Kenji paused, raising his own binoculars. He did not scan for heat, but for shape and color. He swept the landscape slowly, methodically. He saw nothing but an endless sea of green and black. He lowered the binoculars, relying on his own senses. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening. There were no birds, no insects, only the drip, drip, drip of water and the sound of his own blood pulsing in his ears. He opened his eyes and turned his head slightly to the left. Something was off, a patch of color that did not belong. He moved towards it, his boots sinking into the soft moss. It was a small, blue nylon tent, almost completely hidden behind a large formation of volcanic rock. The fabric was slick with rain, sagging in the middle where a pole had collapsed. The silence around it was absolute. Found it, Kenji said, his voice low. Yumi and Haruto converged on his position. There was no urgency. The tense condition told the story. This was a recovery, not a rescue. Haruto approached the tent flap. "Hello," he called out, his voice loud and strangely intrusive. "This is search and rescue." There was no answer. There never was. He slowly unzipped the flap. Kenji stood a few feet away, his gaze averted. He had learned long ago not to look first. It was a small act of self-preservation, a way to prepare himself for what he was about to see. He focused instead on a single, perfect fern growing from a crack in the rock, its fronds beaded with moisture. Haruto's sigh was heavy with resignation. "We have him." Kenji turned. The man was inside the tent, sitting upright, his back against the rear wall. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with dark hair matted to his forehead. His skin was pale, waxy, with a bluish tint around his lips. In his lap, resting on his crossed legs, was an open notebook. His right hand still held a pen, its nib resting on the paper as if he had merely paused mid-thought. No obvious signs of trauma. No pills. "Looks like starvation or exposure," Yumi noted, her voice steady as she began the grim process of documentation, taking pictures with her phone. Kenji's attention was fixed on the notebook. It was a simple, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with elegant, precise Japanese characters. The ink was a deep, lustrous black. His eyes followed the script, reading the final entry. It was a poem, dark and beautiful, about the color of silence and the weight of the sky. The final lines were a stark, desperate plea. Then, at the very bottom of the page, was a single, unfinished sentence. The handwriting was different here, shakier, as if written with the last dregs of strength. The pen had formed the characters with a spidery, uneven pressure. "The sorrow does not fade, it only." The sentence stopped. The pen's nib rested just beyond the final dash, a tiny black point of ink bleeding slightly into the fiber of the paper. A full stop that was not a full stop. An ending that was not an ending. Kenji could not pull his eyes away from it. The unfinished thought felt like a physical presence in the small, cramped tent. It was a question hanging in the cold, still air, a hook waiting for an eye. He could almost hear the man's final, ragged breath, the scratch of the pen, the silence that followed. "Kenji, the bag." Haruto's voice broke the spell. Kenji blinked, pulling his gaze from the notebook. He unclipped the body bag from his pack and unfolded it. The rustle of the thick plastic was loud in the quiet forest. He and Haruto worked together, their movements practiced and impersonal. They gently eased the body out of the tent. It was stiff, cold. The man's head lolled to one side, his empty eyes staring at the mossy ground. As they worked, the notebook slid from the man's lap and fell face down onto the damp earth. Yumi was on the radio, reporting their findings, her voice a monotone stream of official jargon. Haruto was focused on securing the body bag's zipper. No one was looking at the notebook. Kenji stared at it, a small black rectangle lying in the dirt. It contained the man's final words, his last desperate attempt to explain or understand. It was evidence. It should be collected, catalogued, and handed over to the police with the rest of the personal effects. It was part of a procedure he had followed 100 times. But this felt different. That unfinished sentence was a splinter in his mind. It demanded completion. It demanded an answer. With a swift, almost unconscious movement, Kenji bent down. He picked up the notebook, wiped the dirt from its cover with his thumb, and slid it into the deep inner pocket of his jacket. The leather was cold against his chest. Its weight was small, but he felt it more than the 30-pound pack on his back. It was a secret, a transgression. "Everything secure?" Haruto asked, turning to him. Kenji zipped up his jacket, his hand resting for a moment on the hard rectangle hidden within. "Yes," he said, his voice perfectly even. "Everything is secure." They carried the body back to the truck. The journey was slow, arduous. The weight of the dead man seemed to grow with every step, a physical manifestation of the forest's sorrow. Kenji did not speak. His mind was a blank slate, save for the 7 words and the long, final dash etched into his memory. The sorrow does not fade, it only. Only what? The question echoed with the rhythmic slosh of the body bag, the soft crunch of his boots on the forest floor, and the steady, silent dripping of the trees. Chapter 2: The Sister's Ghost. 2 days later, the rain had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and sharp. A weak, watery sun filtered through the high windows of the station, illuminating swirling dust motes in the air. The oppressive humidity had been replaced by a crisp autumn chill. Kenji sat at the table, disassembling his headlamp cleaning contacts that were already spotless. The motion was automatic, a way to occupy his hands while his mind gnawed at the unfinished sentence. The notebook was hidden in his locker, tucked inside a spare boot. He had not looked at it again since that day in the forest, but he didn't need to. The words were burned into his thoughts. He had tried to complete the sentence himself, sitting alone in his small room at night. It only changes shape, it only waits, it only grows. None of them felt right. They were his words, not the dead man's. They lacked the finality of truth. Haruto was on the phone, his back to the room. His voice was a low rumble, the official tone he used with the prefectural police. "Yes, Mizushima Ren, age 28, from Tokyo. The family has been notified." He paused. "I understand. Yes. His effects are here, ready for collection." Kenji's hands stilled. Ren Mizushima. The name attached itself to the pale face in the tent, giving the ghost a form. Ren. Haruto hung up the phone and turned, his eyes finding Kenji's. "The sister is coming. Today." "Within the hour," Haruto said, pouring himself another mug of the station's perpetually stewing tea. "She wants to see where he was found." "You're not going to take her," Kenji stated. It was against protocol, a rule Haruto enforced with an iron will. Civilians were not allowed into the forest on official S&R business, especially not the grieving family of a victim. It was cruel but necessary. The forest was not a place for memorials. "I am going to tell her no," Haruto corrected. "And you are going to stay quiet while I do it. Your face is too soft for this kind of work, Kenji. You look at them and they think you share their pain." "I do," Kenji said quietly. "That," Haruto said, taking a loud sip of his tea, "is the problem." An hour later, a small, dark sedan pulled into the gravel lot in front of the station. A young woman emerged. She was tall and slender, dressed in a simple black coat. Her hair was cut in a sharp, modern style that framed a face of pale, angular beauty. As she approached the station door, Kenji saw her expression. It was not one of tearful grief. It was one of fierce, unyielding determination. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and angry. Haruto met her at the door, his posture already defensive. "Ishikawa-san?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. "I am. Please come in, Mizushima-san." She stepped inside, her gaze sweeping the room, taking in the maps, the gear, the two men standing there. Her eyes lingered on Kenji for a moment before settling back on the station chief. "I am Mizushima Hinata," she said, foregoing the customary bow for a direct, almost confrontational stare. "Ren's sister." "My deepest condolences for your loss," Haruto recited, the words sounding hollow and practiced. He gestured to a chair. "Please sit. We have his personal effects boxed." Hinata ignored the chair. "I want to see the place." Haruto's jaw tightened. "I'm afraid that is not possible. The area is not safe, and it is our policy." "I am not a tourist," Hinata cut him off, her voice sharp as glass. "My brother is dead. I want to see where he spent his final moments. I need to understand why." "Understanding is not something this forest offers," Haruto said, his tone hardening. "We recovered your brother. The police have ruled it. The case is closed." "For you, perhaps," Hinata shot back. "Not for me. My brother was a fighter. He suffered from depression, yes, but he was not weak. He would not simply lie down and give up. Something happened to him in there." Kenji watched the exchange, a knot tightening in his stomach. He felt the weight of the notebook in his locker, a silent accomplice to the woman's conviction. She was right. Something had happened. The unfinished note was proof of a struggle, not a surrender. "There is nothing to see," Haruto insisted, his patience wearing thin. "Only trees." "Then let me see the trees," she demanded. Her composure finally cracked for a moment, her voice trembling with a frustration that bordered on rage. "He was my brother, my only family. I have a right to know." Kenji saw the flicker of pity in Haruto's eyes, quickly suppressed. He knew the chief was about to deliver the final, bureaucratic no. And in that moment, Kenji made a decision. "He was a poet," Kenji said. The words came out before he could stop them. Both Haruto and Hinata turned to look at him. Haruto's glare was a physical force, a warning to be silent. Hinata's expression was one of guarded surprise. Kenji continued, speaking to her, not to his chief. "The notebook we found with him, it was full of poetry and ink drawings." He was treading on dangerous ground, revealing details he should not. Hinata's stony facade softened, a flicker of pained recognition in her eyes. "He always carried that notebook. He called it his shadow catcher." "His last entry was a poem about silence," Kenji said, the lie coming easily. "It was a partial truth, a careful edit of the reality. He could not mention the final, terrifying sentence. It was very beautiful." Haruto's jaw was set like concrete. He looked as if he wanted to physically restrain Kenji. "He saw beauty in darkness," Hinata said, her voice now a near whisper. "He said it was more honest than the light." She looked directly at Kenji, a silent plea passing between them. "Please, I need to see what he saw." "It's against the rules," Haruto snapped, his voice a low growl aimed at Kenji. "The rules are for the living," Hinata replied, her strength returning. "My brother is beyond them. I am asking for 1 hour of your time. One of you can escort me. I will not be a burden." There was a long, tense silence. Haruto stared at Kenji, his eyes promising a difficult conversation later. Kenji met his gaze, refusing to back down. The weight in his jacket was gone, but the weight in his conscience had doubled. He had inserted himself into this family's grief, drawn in by a single cryptic sentence. Finally, Haruto let out a long, frustrated sigh. He ran a hand over his face, the gesture of a defeated man. 1 hour, he conceded, the words sounding like they were torn from him. He pointed a thick finger at Kenji. You take her, stay on the marked trail, you do not go to the site. Is that clear? You show her the edge of the sector, and that is all. Understood, Kenji said. And Mizashima-san, Haruto added, his voice firm. We are not responsible for what you may find, or for what may find you. The warning hung in the air, but Hinata did not seem to hear it. Her eyes were on Kenji, a flicker of gratitude warring with her deep-seated grief. A short time later, Kenji was leading Hinata along a narrow, muddy trail that wound its way into the Aokigahara. He had given her a spare set of boots and a walking stick. She moved with a surprising agility, her city shoes exchanged for practical gear. Thank you, she said, after several minutes of walking in silence. Your boss was not going to agree. He is concerned for your safety, Kenji said, the excuse sounding weak even to himself. He is concerned with procedure, she corrected. There is a difference. They walked on, the forest swallowing the sound of their footsteps. Kenji felt a familiar prickle on his skin, the sensation of being watched that always accompanied him here. He glanced up at the canopy. A crow was perched on a high branch, its head cocked, its beady black eye seeming to follow their progress. Tell me about the notebook, Hinata said, her voice soft. It's with the police now, Kenji lied. It will be returned to you with his other things. You said he wrote about silence. What else? Kenji thought of the elegant, looping characters, the stark ink-wash drawings of twisted trees and shadow-filled clearings that filled the pages. He had pored over them the night before, trying to decipher their meaning. He wrote about the trees, the rocks, the way the light dies in here. He was trying to understand this place. He was always trying to understand the things that frightened him, she murmured. He thought if he could name them, describe them, they would lose their power. A sound cut through the air. It was faint but clear. The ringtone of a mobile phone. Kenji froze. He looked at Hinata. She was already fumbling in her coat pocket. She pulled out her phone. The screen was dark. That wasn't you, she asked, a line of confusion on her forehead. No, Kenji said, his hand instinctively going to his own device. It was off. The ringing came again, closer this time, from somewhere off the trail to their right. It was a cheerful, generic melody, a sound so alien in this place that it was monstrous. Someone's here, Hinata whispered, her eyes wide. Someone could be lost. Kenji shook his head, a cold dread seeping into him. No, don't. He looked up at the crow. It was still there, but now it was joined by another and another. A small flock of them, all silent, all watching. The Maingarasu, the old keepers called them, the mimic crows. The ringing stopped. It was replaced by a new sound, a voice. A man's voice, faint and strained. Hinata. Hinata gasped, her head whipping around toward the sound. Ren. The name was a choked whisper. It's not him, Kenji said, his voice low and urgent. He grabbed her arm, his grip was tight. It's a trick, the forest. It plays tricks. But it sounded just like him, she insisted, her face pale. She tried to pull away from him to step off the trail. "Hinata, listen to me," Kenji commanded, his voice sharper than he intended. "Your brother is gone. That is not him. It's an echo, something the forest keeps." The voice came again, closer now, laced with a desperate, pleading tone. "Hinata, help me. I'm so cold." Tears streamed down Hinata's face. Her body was tense, torn between Kenji's rational warning and the impossible hope sparked by the voice. "How can you be so sure?" she cried. Kenji looked into her eyes and he gave her the only piece of truth he could offer. "Because the dead don't talk," he said, his own voice tight with a fear he rarely allowed himself to show. "But in this place, the silence does." He tightened his grip on her arm and began to pull her back toward the trailhead, away from the phantom voice and the watchful, silent crows. He did not look back. He could feel the forest's disappointment, a cold, empty hunger in the air around them. It had offered its lure, and he had refused it. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would offer it again. Chapter 3: The Shadow Catcher. The encounter with the mimic crows left a poisonous residue. Hinata was silent on the drive back to the station, her face a pale, strained mask. The fierce anger she had arrived with was gone, replaced by a fragile, haunted look. Kenji felt a pang of guilt. He had wanted to help her, but he had only succeeded in pulling her deeper into the forest's unsettling mystery. He had exposed her to the wound, not the cure. Haruto was waiting for them, leaning against the doorframe of the station, his arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but Kenji knew he was furious. He stepped out of the truck, ready for the confrontation. "My office." "Now," Haruto said, his voice dangerously quiet. He turned and walked inside without a glance at Hinata. Kenji looked at Hinata, who was still sitting in the passenger seat, staring at nothing. "I will be right back," he said softly. "Wait here." He followed Haruto into the small, cluttered office. The chief did not sit down. He stood behind his metal desk, which was piled high with paperwork and old maps. "You went off the trail," Haruto stated. It was not a question. "We heard something," Kenji said. "I thought it could be another person." The lie tasted like ash. "You thought," Haruto repeated, his voice laced with contempt. "You did not think. You reacted. You let her grief, her fantasy, pull you off course. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is? For you, for her." "I had it under control." "No, you did not." Haruto slammed his hand on the desk, rattling a cup full of pens. "The rules are not here for my convenience, Kenji. They are here to keep you alive. They are a wall between this job and your sanity. Every time you bend one, you put a crack in that wall. What did you see?" Kenji hesitated. He could not tell him the truth. Haruto would dismiss it as a stress-induced hallucination, a story the forest tells to weak minds. He would be sent for a psych evaluation, maybe even put on leave. And he could not afford that. Not now. The notebook in his locker felt like a ticking clock. "We saw nothing," Kenji said. "It was just the wind." Haruto stared at him for a long, hard moment, his eyes searching Kenji's face for the truth. Kenji held his gaze, his expression a carefully constructed mask of calm. Finally, Haruto shook his head in disgust. "Get her out of here," he ordered. "Give her the box of effects. Tell her the case is closed and she is not to come back. And Kenji," he added, his voice dropping to a low warning, "fix the crack in your wall before the whole thing comes down." Kenji nodded, a knot of ice in his stomach. He left the office and went to the station's small storage room. He retrieved a simple cardboard box sealed with tape. It contained Ren Mizushima's wallet, his keys, his phone, and a few other personal items. It did not contain his notebook. He carried the box out to Hinata, who had finally gotten out of the truck. He handed it to her. Her hands trembled as she took it. "These are his things," Kenji said, the official words feeling like a betrayal. "The police have completed their report." Hinata clutched the box to her chest. "The voice," she started, her own voice barely a whisper. "What was that?" "The forest is full of strange acoustics," Kenji said, repeating the official, rational explanation he had given to dozens of grieving family members before. "The wind through the trees, the animals. It can sound like many things." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. He knew she did not believe him. She had heard what she had heard, and she had seen the fear in his own eyes. He had confirmed her deepest, most terrifying suspicion. Her brother had not simply died, he had been taken by something. "He had a sketchbook," she said suddenly. "A big one with a charcoal cover. He took it everywhere. It was more important to him than his wallet. It's not in the box." Kenji's blood ran cold. He had seen no sketchbook at the site, only the small, leather-bound journal. "There was nothing else at the scene," he said. "No," she insisted, shaking her head. "Ren would not have gone into that forest without it. He called it his shadow catcher. He drew the things that haunted him. He said it was the only way to see them clearly." Her eyes narrowed. "If it's not in the box, it must still be out there." An idea began to form in Kenji's mind, a dangerous, reckless idea. The sketchbook, the shadow catcher, it was a missing piece. The poems in the journal were abstract, emotional, but the drawings might be literal. They might be a key. "I am going back for it," Hinata declared, her resolve hardening once more. "If you will not help me, I will find a guide who will." "You will not," Kenji said, his voice firm. "You will get yourself killed. That is not a place for amateurs." "Then help me," she pleaded, her voice raw. "You know there is something wrong about what happened. I saw it on your face. You are looking for answers, too." She was right. He could not deny it. His obsession with the unfinished note was a mirror of her obsession with the missing sketchbook. They were both chasing the ghost of Ren Mizushima. He looked back at the station, where Haruto was watching them through the window. Then he looked at Hinata, at her desperate, determined face. He made a choice. He broke another rule. "Not now," he said in a low voice, turning so his back was to the station window. "Go home. I am on duty for the next 2 days. Come back on my next day off. Dawn, I will take you." Relief washed over her face, so potent it was almost painful to see. "You will." "I will," he confirmed. "But you will do exactly as I say. No arguments, no running off. We find the sketchbook and then we leave, that is all." "I promise," she said, clutching the box of her brother's belongings. She gave him a deep, formal bow, a gesture of profound gratitude. Then she got in her car and drove away, leaving Kenji alone in the gravel lot, the weight of his broken promises settling on his shoulders. The next 2 days were a form of purgatory. Kenji went through the motions of his job, his mind elsewhere. He cleaned gear, filed reports, and patrolled the well-worn perimeter trails. Haruto watched him with a hawk's eye, their conversations reduced to curt, one-word exchanges. The tension between them was a thick, suffocating blanket. At night, Kenji did not sleep. He sat in his room with Ren Mizushima's journal. He read the poems again and again, trying to absorb their meaning. They were filled with a profound sense of despair, but also a strange, clinical curiosity. Ren had not been just a victim of the forest. He had been its student. He wrote of the geometry of sorrow and the architecture of silence. He was trying to map the place's internal landscape. And then there were the drawings, small, intricate inkwases that filled the margins, twisted trees that looked like grasping hands, rocks that resembled screaming faces, and one recurring image, a hunched, faceless figure drawn with frantic, overlapping lines. It was always depicted at a distance, half hidden by trees. Beneath one of the drawings, Ren had written a single word, griever. On the morning of his day off, Kenji met Hinata at the trailhead as promised. The sun was not yet up, and the world was a wash of gray and silver. He was dressed in his own hiking gear, his official uniform left behind. He was acting not as a ranger, but as a man possessed by a dead poet's mystery. Hinata was already there, packing by her car. She was dressed for the forest, a small, practical pack on her back. "Are you ready?" he asked. She just nodded, her jaw tight. They entered the forest together. This time, Kenji did not stick to the trails. He navigated by memory and instinct, moving through the dense undergrowth towards Sector 47. He felt a strange sense of homecoming, of purpose. He was not here to recover a body, but to recover a truth. It took them nearly 2 hours to reach the small clearing where Ren's tent had been. The yellow tape they had put up was still there, a stark, artificial boundary against the wilderness. Kenji ducked under it. "This is it," he said. Hinata stopped at the edge of the tape, her hand going to her mouth. She stared at the patch of flattened moss where the tent had stood. It was a grave marker without a grave. "We need to search," Kenji said, snapping himself back to the task. "The sketchbook is large. He would have kept it protected. Look for overhangs, hollow logs, anything that could offer shelter from the rain." They began to search, moving in slow, expanding circles from the campsite. The forest was silent, watchful. Kenji could feel its immense, passive pressure. It was not aggressive. It was simply waiting. Hinata found it. She was standing near a large, gnarled tree whose roots had grown over a massive slab of volcanic rock, creating a small, cave-like hollow. She was on her knees, reaching into the darkness. She pulled out a large, charcoal-gray object wrapped in a plastic bag. "The shadow catcher," she breathed, her voice filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. She carefully unwrapped it. The sketchbook was damp but not soaked. She opened it, her fingers tracing the cover. Kenji moved to her side, his heart pounding. "Let me see." The first few pages were filled with charcoal studies of trees and rocks, meticulously detailed. But as they turned the pages, the drawings became more disturbing. The landscapes grew twisted, distorted, as if seen through a lens of pure fear. Perspectives warped. Familiar shapes became monstrous. Then they found the portraits. There were dozens of them, page after page of the same entity. The hunched, weeping figure from the journal, the griever. In the sketchbook, it was rendered in terrifying detail. Long, unnaturally thin limbs, a body that seemed to be made of shadow and rags, and no face. Where a face should be, there was only a smooth, blank surface like polished bone. In some drawings, the griever was far away. In others, it was closer, its posture menacing. And on the final page, it was standing directly in front of the artist, its long, shadowy fingers reaching out. The charcoal was smeared, as if Ren had dropped the pencil in a final, convulsive spasm of terror. Kenji stared at the final drawing, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. This was what Ren had seen. This was the thing he had tried to capture, to name. This was the source of the sorrow. A branch snapped behind them. Kenji spun around, his hand flying to the hunting knife on his belt. Hinata let out a small cry, scrambling to her feet and pressing herself against the tree. There was nothing there, only the dense, silent woods. "What was that?" Hinata whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Stay close to me," Kenji ordered, his own voice tight. He began to scan the trees, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. He saw the deer first. A large Sika stag standing perfectly still not 20 yards away. It was not grazing. It was not moving. It was simply staring at them, its dark eyes flat and empty. A still deer, a watcher, an omen. Then Kenji saw the figure. It was exactly as Ren had drawn it. Hunched, shadowed, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was not moving. It was just there, a patch of deeper darkness in the gloom. The griever. Kenji felt a wave of emotion crash over him. It was not fear. It was a vast, bottomless despair, a soul-crushing wave of pure hopelessness. He suddenly understood everything. His job, his life, his search for answers, it was all pointless. There was no hope, no meaning, only this all-consuming sorrow. The desire to simply lie down, to close his eyes and let the forest take him, was overwhelming. He saw Hinata stagger, her face ashen. She was feeling it too. Her hands went to her head, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Kenji fought against it. He focused on a single point of reality, the sketchbook still clutched in Hinata's hand. Ren had fought this thing, he had faced it, he had drawn it. That was an act of defiance, not surrender. The sorrow does not fade, it only grows closer. The thought flashed through his mind, a moment of horrifying clarity. That was the answer. It fed on despair. It drew you in and then it consumed you. "Run," Kenji croaked, the word a physical effort. He grabbed Hinata's arm, his own movements sluggish, heavy, as if moving through water. He pulled her with him, stumbling away from the figure, away from the crushing weight of its presence. He did not look back. He did not need to. He could feel the griever's cold, sorrowful gaze on them as they fled, and he knew that this was only the beginning. He had found the shadow catcher. He had seen the shadow, and now the shadow had seen him. Chapter 4: The Contagion. The flight from the forest was a blur of panicked motion and ragged breathing. Kenji dragged Hinata behind him, his own lungs burning, his legs pumping on sheer adrenaline. The crushing despair of the griever's presence lessened with every yard they put between themselves and the creature, but it did not vanish. It left a residue, a cold, greasy film on his thoughts. It was like the lingering chill of a fever, a sickness that had seeped into his bones. They burst out of the trailhead into the pale morning light, stumbling like refugees from a war zone. Hinata collapsed against the side of her car, gasping for air, her knuckles white where she clutched the shadow catcher sketchbook. Kenji leaned over, his hands on his knees, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and exertion. "What was that?" Hinata finally managed to say, her voice shaking. "Kenji, what was that thing?" Kenji straightened up, forcing himself to take a slow, deep breath. He had to be the anchor. He had to be the ranger. "I don't know," he lied, because the truth was too monstrous to speak aloud in the open air. "It was the thing that killed your brother. It was a hallucination, the stress, the atmosphere in there. It affects people." "No," she said, shaking her head, her eyes wide and frantic. "That was not a hallucination. We both saw it. We both felt it. It was real." She held up the sketchbook. "And he saw it too. He drew it. It hunted him." Kenji could not argue. She was right. He ran a hand through his damp hair, his mind racing. They had trespassed. They had stolen something from the forest, a record, a testimony, and the forest had shown them its warden. "We need to leave," he said, his voice firm. "Now." He looked around, a paranoid dread creeping up his spine. The road was empty. The world was quiet, but he could not shake the feeling that they were still being watched. He imagined the griever standing just inside the tree line, a patient, silent figure of despair. Hinata, still shaking, got into the driver's seat of her car. Kenji walked over to the passenger side. "I'll follow you back to the city," he said. "No," she replied, her voice regaining a sliver of its former strength. "You have your own life. I need to think." She clutched the sketchbook to her chest as if it were a shield. "Thank you, Kenji, for believing me, for helping me." "Hinata," he started, wanting to warn her, to tell her that what they had experienced was not over, that it might follow them. But what could he say? "Don't be sad or the monster will get you." It sounded like a child's fairy tale. "I'll be okay," she said, though her pale face suggested otherwise. She started the car's engine, the sound a welcome intrusion of normalcy. "I will call you." He stepped back and watched her drive away, her small sedan kicking up a cloud of gravel. He stood there until the car disappeared around a bend, leaving him alone with the silent, brooding forest. He felt a profound sense of foreboding. He had not contained the situation. He had merely released it into the wider world, like a carrier of a plague. His return to the station was quiet. It was still his day off and the building was empty. He showered, scrubbing his skin as if he could wash away the forest's psychic grime. He changed into his uniform, the familiar fabric a small comfort, a return to order and procedure. But when he looked in the mirror, he saw the face of a stranger. There were new, deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes. His gaze was haunted. He spent the rest of the day in a state of high alert. Every shadow seemed to shift in the corner of his eye. Every gust of wind sounded like a mournful sigh. He tried to busy himself with routine tasks, sharpening tools, checking inventory, but his focus was shattered. The image of the griever was burned into his mind. He could still feel the phantom weight of its despair. The next morning, his shift began. Haruto was already at the station, a thundercloud of disapproval radiating from him. He did not mention Kenji's unsanctioned trip with Hinata, which was somehow worse than an open confrontation. The silence was a condemnation. The day was mercifully busy. A call came in about a group of lost hikers, foreign tourists who had wandered off a trail looking for a scenic waterfall. The search was straightforward, a simple matter of logistics and tracking. Kenji, Haruto, and Yumi worked with practiced efficiency. They found the hikers by midday, dehydrated and spooked, but unharmed. For a few hours, as he focused on the familiar procedures of rescue, Kenji felt almost normal. He was a ranger again, a man with a purpose. He was helping people. He was in control. But as they escorted the grateful tourists back to the trailhead, he saw it. At the edge of the parking lot, half hidden by the trunk of a large cedar, a figure stood. It was hunched, indistinct, a smudge of darkness against the bright afternoon. Kenji froze mid-stride, his blood turning to ice. "What is it?" Haruto asked, noticing his sudden stop. Kenji stared at the spot. The figure was gone. There was nothing there but shadows and trees. Had it been his imagination, a trick of the light? "Nothing," Kenji mumbled, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I thought I saw a deer." Haruto gave him a long, suspicious look, but said nothing. The contagion had spread. It was no longer confined to the deep woods. It was following him. That night Kenji could not rest. He sat in his small room, the leather-bound journal open on his lap. He felt a desperate need to understand what was happening to him, and he believed the answer was hidden in Ren Mizushima's words. He read the poems aloud, his voice a low whisper in the quiet room. He came to a section he had previously skimmed over. It was not a poem, but a series of prose observations, written with a chilling, academic detachment. "The entity which I have named the griever appears to be a psychic predator. It does not hunt the body, it hunts the will. Its primary weapon is a projected field of intense emotional despair. Proximity to the entity results in acute symptoms, hopelessness, abulia, the pathological inability to make decisions, and a profound sense of worthlessness. It is, in essence, a living embodiment of depression." Kenji's hands trembled as he read. Ren had not just been a victim, he had been a researcher, documenting his own destruction. The griever is drawn to existing sources of sorrow, much like a scavenger is drawn to carrion. It amplifies this sorrow, feeds on it, and uses it as a lure to draw its victims deeper into its territory. But I suspect it is also capable of creating its own hunting grounds. It can infect a location or, I fear, a person, marking them with a seed of its own despair. This seed then grows, nurtured by the host's own negative emotions, until it is strong enough to call the master back. A cold dread washed over Kenji. The sighting at the trailhead, the constant feeling of being watched. He had been marked. He was carrying a seed of the forest's sorrow inside him. The next paragraph was even more terrifying. I have observed that the entity has a secondary, more subtle method of attack. It can manipulate perception. It creates auditory and visual phenomena tailored to the victim. It learns its target's fears and regrets, and it projects them into the world. It showed me my father's disappointed face in the bark of a tree. It whispered my publisher's rejection in the sound of the wind. It is a parasite of the mind. Kenji slammed the journal shut. His heart was pounding. The mimic crows, the voice of Ren calling for his sister. It had all been a calculated attack. He stood up and began to pace the small room. He felt trapped. The forest was no longer just a place on a map. It was an infection inside him, a sentient malignancy that was learning his secrets. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He snatched it up, hoping it was Hinata, needing to know if she was safe, if she was experiencing the same things. But it was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello." There was only static on the line, a sound like rushing water or wind. But underneath the static he could hear something else. A faint, rhythmic sound. Weeping. A deep, shuddering, hopeless sound that made the hair on his arms stand up. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice tight. The weeping continued, growing slightly louder. It was a sound of absolute, bottomless grief. It was the sound of the griever. Kenji threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall and clattered to the floor. But the sound did not stop. The weeping continued, now seeming to come from the phone itself, a disembodied sob filling the small, silent room. He scrambled for the phone, his hands shaking. He fumbled with it, finally managing to pull the battery out. The weeping stopped. Silence rushed back in, heavy and menacing. Kenji was breathing heavily, his back pressed against the wall. He was not safe, not even here. The forest had his number. It had found a way into his sanctuary. He looked at the journal lying on his bed. It was not just a collection of a dead man's thoughts. It was a weapon. It was a field guide to the enemy. Ren Mizushima had failed to save himself, but he had left behind a map of the battlefield. A new resolve hardened within him. He was a ranger. He was a rescuer. And this was the ultimate rescue mission. He had to find a way to fight back, not just for himself, but for Hinata, and for the memory of the man who had stared into the abyss and tried to take notes. He picked up the journal, his fear slowly being replaced by a cold, hard anger. He would not be a victim. He would be a hunter. He would learn the griever's weaknesses, and he would find a way to drag it out of the shadows and into the light. Chapter 5. The Architecture of Silence. The call solidified Kenji's resolve into something sharp and dangerous. Fear was a paralytic, but anger was a stimulant. He spent the next few days in a state of heightened, almost feverish activity. He pored over Ren's journal, cross-referencing the poems and observations with the charcoal drawings from the shadow catcher, which Hinata had photographed and sent to him before she disappeared back into the anonymity of Tokyo. He began to create his own map, not a topographical one of hills and trails, but a psychological one. He marked the locations of every encounter, the mimic crows, the still deer, the site of the griever sighting. He created a timeline, noting the entity's escalating behavior. He was treating the supernatural like a criminal investigation, trying to find a pattern, a motive, a weakness. Haruto watched him with growing concern. Kenji had become distant, his eyes always tired, his movements quick and jerky. He would stop mid-sentence, his head cocked as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. "You're on edge," Haruto said one afternoon, as Kenji was meticulously sharpening a set of climbing carabiners that were already razor-sharp. "I'm fine," Kenji replied, not looking up from his work. The rasp of the metal file was a comforting, solid sound. "No, you're not," Haruto pressed, his voice softer than usual. "You look like you haven't slept in a week. This job, it grinds you down, Kenji. Maybe you need a break. A real one. Go to the city. See something other than trees for a while." "I can't," Kenji said. The thought of leaving, of abandoning his post, filled him with a new kind of terror. He felt like a soldier who could not desert his watch. What if the griever made a move while he was gone? Who would be there to notice? "This is not a suggestion," Haruto's voice hardened again. "Your psych evaluation is next month. If you go into it looking like this, they'll ground you. I'm putting you on a week's mandatory leave starting tomorrow." Kenji looked up, his eyes flashing with anger. "You can't do that." "I'm the chief. I can," Haruto stated, his expression unyielding. "Go clear your head, that's an order." Kenji knew he could not refuse. He felt a surge of panic. A week away was a week of blindness. A week for the griever to act unopposed. But as he looked at Haruto's stern, worried face, a new plan began to form, a way to turn this forced exile into an opportunity. "Fine," Kenji said, his voice clipped. "I'll go to Tokyo." The next morning he packed a small bag. He included a change of clothes, his wallet, and Ren Mizushima's journal. It felt strange and illicit, like smuggling a forbidden text out of a forgotten country. He took a bus from the small town near the forest, watching the dense sea of trees recede until it was replaced by farmland, then suburbs, and finally the sprawling, concrete labyrinth of Tokyo. The city was a shock to his system. The noise, the crowds, the endless motion. It was the polar opposite of the Jukai's oppressive silence. For a few hours he felt a sense of relief. The griever felt distant here, its power seemingly diluted by the sheer psychic noise of millions of people. He checked into a small, anonymous business hotel in the Shinjuku district and tried to be a tourist. He walked through the crowded streets, ate a bowl of ramen in a noisy shop, and visited a shrine. But the feeling of being watched never completely left him. A shadow in a crowded subway station, a face in a window, a moment of profound, inexplicable sadness while surrounded by laughing people. The seed was still inside him. He was not in Tokyo to rest. He was there to continue his investigation. Ren Mizushima had lived there. He had family, friends, a life. Kenji was going to trace his final steps, not in the forest but in the city that had shaped him. His first stop was a small, independent bookstore in the Jimbacho district, an area famous for its second-hand bookshops. According to a notation in the journal, it was Ren's favorite. Kenji found the address, a narrow storefront tucked between two larger buildings. The shop was a dusty, cluttered haven, filled with floor-to-ceiling shelves of old books. An elderly man with a kind, wrinkled face sat behind the counter. He looked up as Kenji entered, a small bell on the door announcing his arrival. "Welcome," the bookseller said. Kenji approached the counter, pulling out a photograph of Ren he had taken from the case file. "I am looking for information about this man," he said. "Mizushima Ren. I believe he was a customer here." The bookseller squinted at the photograph. A look of sad recognition dawned on his face. "Ah, Ren-san," he said with a sigh. "A tragedy. I read about it in the papers. Such a brilliant, troubled young man. He came in here often. He had a great love for the old poets." "I found his journal," Kenji said, choosing his words carefully. "He mentioned buying a book here shortly before he left, an old book of poetry about the Jukai." The bookseller's brow furrowed in thought. "About the Jukai, that is an unusual topic. Most people prefer to forget that place." He thought for a moment, then his eyes lit up. "Ah, yes, I remember now. It was a very rare volume, from the Meiji era. Kokoro no Cage it was called. The Heart's Shadow." "Do you remember anything about it?" Kenji pressed. "It was not a celebratory book," the bookseller said, lowering his voice. "It was written by a reclusive monk who lived on the edge of the forest. He believed the place was a gateway, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. His poems were disturbing. They spoke of the architecture of silence and the sorrow that walks like a man." Kenji felt a chill run down his spine. The architecture of silence. It was the exact phrase Ren had used in his journal. Ren hadn't just been inspired by the forest. He had been following a script written over a century ago. "Did you read the book?" Kenji asked. "Only parts," the bookseller admitted. "The language was archaic and the feeling it gave me was not pleasant. It was a book that felt unwell. I was glad to be rid of it, to be honest." Ren-san was very excited to find it. He said he felt it had been waiting for him. Kenji left the bookstore with a new, vital piece of the puzzle. Ren's obsession was not entirely his own. It had been guided, perhaps even summoned, by this old, malevolent book of poetry. His next stop was more difficult. He went to the Mizushima family home, a modest, well-kept house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He had no right to be there, no official reason. He was acting on a compulsion, a need to see the place where Ren's life had begun. He was about to turn away when the front door opened. A stern-looking older man stepped out. He was dressed in a formal suit, his graying hair perfectly combed. He had the same angular features as Hinata, the same sharp eyes as Ren. It was their father. Kenji froze, unsure what to do, but the man did not seem to notice him. He was looking at something across the street. Kenji followed his gaze. Standing under a ginkgo tree, its leaves a brilliant yellow, was a hunched, indistinct figure, a smudge of darkness against the bright autumn day. The griever. It was watching the house. Kenji's breath caught in his throat. It had followed him. Or perhaps it had been here all along, drawn to the epicenter of the family's grief. Mr. Mizushima seemed to shiver, rubbing his arms as if a sudden chill had passed through him. He looked around, his eyes passing right over the spot where the griever stood, and then went back inside, closing the door. The figure vanished. Kenji stood on the pavement, his body rigid with terror and a sickening understanding. The griever was not just attached to him. It was attached to the entire Mizushima family. It had taken the son, and now it was haunting the father and the daughter. It was a predator, methodically stalking its prey. He walked away from the house, his mind reeling. He needed to warn Hinata. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number. She answered on the second ring. Kenji, her voice was small, frightened. Hinata, it's me. Are you all right? No, she whispered. I keep seeing things, out of the corner of my eye, a man, a shadow, and I have these moments. This horrible sadness comes over me for no reason, so strong I can't breathe. I think I'm going crazy. You're not going crazy, Kenji said, his voice low and urgent. It's real, it's the griever, it's followed you, it's here in Tokyo. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then a soft, choked sob. What does it want? It feeds on sorrow, Hinata, Kenji explained, piecing together the information from the journal and the bookseller. It's a parasite, your family's grief over Ren. It's a beacon for it. It's drawn to you. He heard her take a shaky breath. What do we do? We fight back, Kenji said, a new, desperate plan forming in his mind. The monk who wrote the book, Kokoro no Cage, he didn't just describe the griever, he must have known how to ward it off. He lived on the edge of the forest and survived. The answer has to be in that book. But Ren had that book with him, she said. We didn't find it at the campsite. He must have hidden it, Kenji insisted. Like he hid the shadow catcher. It has to be there somewhere in the forest. It's our only hope. He knew what he was asking. He was asking her to go back to the place of her deepest trauma, the place that had killed her brother. But he also knew it was their only chance. I can't, she whispered. Kenji, I can't go back there. You have to, he urged, his voice filled with a desperate intensity. It will not stop. It will haunt you, it will haunt your father until it breaks you. We have to find that book. We have to learn how to build a wall against the silence. He waited, listening to the sound of her ragged breathing on the other end of the line. He had shown her the monster. Now he was asking her to walk back into its lair. It was a terrible choice, an impossible one. Okay, she finally said, her voice barely audible but firm. I'll do it. Chapter 6, The Heart's Shadow. The decision to return to the forest hung between them, a pact sealed in desperation. Kenji cut his leave short, fabricating a story for Haruto about a family emergency. The chief did not look convinced, his eyes hard and suspicious, but he signed the paperwork without comment. The unspoken chasm between the two men had widened into a canyon. Kenji knew he was likely sacrificing his career, but his priorities had shifted. The neatly defined world of S and R procedure seemed like a child's game compared to the elemental horror he now faced. He met Hinata at the same trailhead under the same cold, gray sky. She looked different. The fragile, haunted woman was gone, replaced by someone who looked like a soldier preparing for a final, hopeless battle. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set, her eyes burning with a grim fire. She carried a larger pack this time, and a sharpened hiking axe hung from her belt. It's getting worse, she said, foregoing any greeting. I saw it in my apartment last night, just standing in the hallway. I turned on the light and it was gone, but I felt it. The cold. It's testing our defenses, Kenji replied, his own nerves stretched thin. It knows we're planning something. He looked toward the tree line. The forest seemed darker today, its silence more profound, more menacing. We need to be smart. It will be expecting us. Their goal was Sector 47, the place where Ren had made his last stand. They were searching for a ghost's library, a single book in a wilderness of millions of trees. The task was impossible, but it was the only task they had. Ren was meticulous, Hinata said as they began their trek. He was a poet, but he had an engineer's mind. If he hid the book, he would have done it logically. He would have protected it, but he also would have left a way for it to be found. A clue, Kenji asked. A pattern, she corrected. He was obsessed with patterns, in art, in nature, in his own sorrow. They moved deeper into the forest, the air growing heavy and still. Kenji felt the familiar pressure, the sense of being watched. This time, however, it felt different. It was not the passive observation of before. It was active, hostile. The forest was aware of their purpose. Paths that Kenji remembered seemed to twist in on themselves. Familiar landmarks, a uniquely shaped rock, a lightning-scarred tree, were gone, as if the forest was actively rearranging its geography to confuse them. Yumi's faith in technology had been naive, but Haruto's old wisdom was proving true. The compass was the only thing they could trust. After 2 hours of disorienting hiking, they reached the clearing. The yellow tape was tattered, torn by the wind. A deep chill hung in the air, a localized cold spot that had nothing to do with the weather. "It's here," Hinata whispered, rubbing her arms. "It's close." Kenji could feel it too. The oppressive weight of despair was a physical presence, pressing in on them from all sides. He fought it, focusing on Ren's journal, on his anger, on Hinata's grim face. He would not let it win. "We search," he said, his voice strained. "Look for anything out of place, a marker, a symbol." They began a systematic search of the area around the campsite. Hinata went to the hollow tree where she had found the shadow catcher, her eyes scanning the gnarled roots. Kenji moved toward the rock formation that had hidden Ren's tent. He ran his hands over the cold, damp stone, looking for any sign of a carving, a loose rock, anything. He found it on the far side of the formation, a spot hidden from the main clearing. It was a symbol, carved into the rock with a knife. A simple circle with a single, vertical line drawn through its center. "Hinata," he called, his voice low, "over here." She came to his side. She stared at the symbol, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "That's his seal," she said. "His personal hanko. He designed it himself. It was on all his notebooks, all his paintings." "It's a marker," Kenji said, a surge of adrenaline cutting through the despair. He was telling us where to look. The symbol was carved at the base of the rock formation. Kenji knelt down, examining the ground. The moss and leaves were thick, undisturbed. But as he ran his hands over the area directly beneath the symbol, he felt something hard and flat just under the surface. He began to dig with his hands, tearing away the moss and loose soil. Hinata knelt beside him, using her own hands to clear the dirt. A few inches down, they uncovered a flat slab of shale. It was not native to the area. It had been placed there. With a grunt of effort, Kenji pried the slab loose. Underneath was a small, dark cavity, and inside the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, was a book. Kokoro no Cage, the Heart's Shadow. Kenji's hands trembled as he lifted it from its hiding place. It was smaller than he had imagined, bound in dark, cracked leather. It felt cold to the touch, unnaturally so. He carefully unwrapped the oilcloth. The book seemed to absorb the light, its cover a patch of pure blackness. He opened it. The pages were yellowed, brittle with age. The text was handwritten in an old, elegant script, the ink faded but still legible. As his eyes fell upon the words, he felt a wave of dizziness. The language was dense, archaic, but the meaning, the raw emotion behind it, was potent. It was a text saturated with a century of fear. "We need to leave," Hinata urged, her eyes darting nervously toward the trees. "We have what we came for. Let's go." But Kenji was captivated. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the monk's spidery handwriting. He was not just looking for a ward or a prayer. He was looking for a weapon. He found a chapter near the end of the book. The title was stark, "On the Unmaking of Shadows." The monk wrote that the griever was a creature of pure emotion. It had no true physical form. It was a psychic knot, a vortex of sorrow. It could not be killed with a blade or a bullet. It could only be starved or unraveled. "The griever feeds on despair," Kenji read, his lips moving silently. "It cannot consume that which it cannot comprehend. It is blind to a heart filled with peace, with acceptance. But it is repulsed by a stronger, sharper emotion. It fears rage. It fears defiance. But most of all, the shadow fears the light. Not the light of the sun, but the light of a will that refuses to be broken. A single, focused point of pure, undiluted hope is anathema to it." A twig snapped behind them, a loud, sharp crack that shattered the silence. Kenji looked up from the book. Hinata was already on her feet, the hiking axe in her hands. Standing at the edge of the clearing, no more than 30 feet away, was the griever. It was clearer now, more solid than it had been before. It seemed to have drawn strength from their fear, their intrusion. Its long, ragged limbs were tensed, its faceless head tilted as if listening. The air grew thick, heavy, and the wave of despair that washed over them was a physical blow. Kenji felt his knees weaken, his resolve crumbling. The book felt impossibly heavy in his hands. The words blurred. What was the point? Hope, defiance. They were just words on a page. The sorrow was real. The sorrow was everything. He looked at Hinata. She was on the verge of collapse, her face a mask of terror. Tears streamed down her cheeks. The axe in her hands wavered. The griever had them. It was feeding on their fear, growing stronger with every passing second. But then something shifted in Hinata's expression. Her terror was being burned away by something else. Rage. A pure, undiluted fury. "You took him," she hissed, her voice a low, animalistic growl. She took a step toward the creature. "You took my brother." The griever seemed to recoil slightly, as if surprised. Kenji watched, his mind struggling to break free from the suffocating blanket of despair. He saw Hinata's rage, a bright, burning flame in the suffocating darkness, a stronger, sharper emotion. He forced himself to think of Haruto's angry, worried face, of Yumi's misplaced faith in technology, of the tourists he had saved. He thought of Ren Mizushima, not as a victim, but as a fighter, a man who had faced this thing with a pen and a piece of paper, trying to map its darkness. He clung to these thoughts, these small points of light. He focused on his duty, on his promise to Hinata. He focused on his own anger at this thing that had poisoned his mind and stolen lives. The weight in the air lessened almost imperceptibly. He could breathe again. He could think. "Hinata, no," he shouted, finding his voice. "Don't fight it, you'll feed it." He looked desperately at the book, at the monk's final words. The shadow cannot exist in the light. It must be shown itself. It must be named. It must be seen. An idea, insane and terrifying, bloomed in his mind. It was not a weapon. It was a mirror. "The sketchbook," he yelled. "Get the shadow catcher." Hinata, momentarily confused, hesitated. The griever took a shambling step forward. "Get it," Kenji screamed, his voice raw. She seemed to understand. She backed away, fumbling in her pack, and pulled out the charcoal sketchbook. "Open it to the last page," he commanded, his eyes locked on the approaching horror. "The final portrait." She did as he said, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She held up the sketchbook, its pages fluttering in the still air. She held up Ren's final, terrifyingly intimate drawing of the griever. Kenji held up the monk's ancient book. The griever stopped, its faceless head tilted, swiveling from the ancient text to the modern charcoal drawing. It was trapped between two reflections of itself, one a fearful prayer, the other a defiant act of witnessing. "We see you," Kenji said, his voice ringing with a strength he did not know he possessed. "We see you for what you are, a shadow, a memory, an echo of sadness." He took a step forward, holding the book out like a ward. "Ren Mizushima saw you, the monk saw you, and we see you now." The griever let out a sound. It was not a roar or a scream. It was a high, thin, keening wail, like the sound of grinding metal and weeping. The air around it began to shimmer, to distort, like heat haze off asphalt. The creature's form began to unravel, its edges fraying like old cloth. The solid darkness of its body seemed to dissolve into a swarm of black, buzzing particles. "We are not afraid," Hinata said, her voice joining his, tears of grief and rage still streaming down her face as she held the portrait of the monster steady. "You have no power here. You are nothing but an absence. You are an unfinished sentence." The keening sound rose in pitch, becoming unbearable. The swarm of particles that was the griever imploded, collapsing in on itself with a silent rush of air. And then it was gone. The oppressive weight lifted. The unnatural cold vanished. The air was just air again. The silence was just silence. Sunlight, real sunlight, seemed to filter through the canopy for the first time, dappling the forest floor in light and shadow. Kenji stood, his chest heaving, the ancient book clutched in his hand. Hinata lowered the sketchbook, her body trembling uncontrollably. They had done it. They had faced the abyss, and they had not fallen in. They stood in the quiet clearing for a long time, the silence no longer menacing but peaceful. They had not killed the griever. They had unmade it. They had shown the shadow its own reflection, and it had ceased to exist. Finally, Kenji looked at Hinata. He saw not a victim but a survivor, and he knew that he was one too. "It's over," he said, the words feeling enormous, final. "Is it?" she asked, her gaze sweeping the now ordinary trees. He looked at the book in his hand, then at the sketchbook she held. They had the tools. They had the knowledge. The forest was still the forest. The sorrow was still there, a part of the soil itself. But the predator that had hunted in its shadows was gone. "The sorrow does not fade," Kenji said softly, finally understanding. "It only becomes a memory." He had finished the sentence. Chapter 7: The Reckoning. The journey out of the forest was a slow, heavy march. The adrenaline had evaporated, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a fragile, brittle silence. Kenji and Hinata did not speak. There were no words for what they had endured. They had stared into the heart of a sentient despair and had, somehow, not been consumed. The ancient book and the charcoal sketchbook, now wrapped and stowed carefully in Kenji's pack, felt like artifacts from a forgotten war, heavy with the weight of their victory. When they reached the trailhead, the world seemed both intensely real and strangely distant. The mundane details, the gravel of the parking lot, the faded paint on Hinata's car, the distant sound of a truck on the main road, were sharp and clear, yet felt as if they belonged to a world Kenji was no longer fully a part of. Hinata leaned against her car, her body trembling with delayed shock. "What now?" she asked, her voice a reedy whisper. Kenji looked at the pack sitting on the ground between them. "We have a responsibility. We have the only known records of this thing. We can't just go back to our lives." "I want to burn them," Hinata said, her eyes fixed on the pack with a mixture of hatred and fear. "I want to burn them and forget any of this ever happened." "We can't," Kenji said, his own voice sounding tired and old. "Forgetting is what allowed it to fester for so long. The monk, Ren. They tried to warn people. We have to be the ones who listen." An impasse hung between them, the first crack in their hard-won alliance. For her, the books were a curse. For him, they were a duty. Before they could argue further, another vehicle pulled into the lot. It was the station's truck. Haruto was behind the wheel. He got out of the truck, his movements stiff. He did not look at Hinata. His eyes, hard and cold as river stones, were locked on Kenji. He walked over and stopped in front of them, his presence a wall of disapproval. "Your family emergency seems to have resolved itself," Haruto said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Kenji did not flinch. The time for lies and evasions was over. There was no emergency. "I am aware," Haruto said. He gestured with his chin toward Kenji's pack. "You found what you were looking for. It wasn't a question." Hinata tensed, ready for a confrontation, but Kenji placed a calming hand on her arm. He looked his chief in the eye. He was tired of the secrets. He was tired of fighting this war alone. "Yes," Kenji said, "we did." "Get in the truck," Haruto ordered. He then turned his gaze to Hinata. "Mizushima-san, it would be best if you went home now. This no longer concerns you." Everything that happens in that forest concerns me, she shot back, her spirit flaring. Let him handle this, Kenji said to her quietly. I will call you. She hesitated, her eyes darting from Kenji to Haruto's implacable face. Finally, she nodded, a silent acknowledgement that this was a battle she could not fight for him. She got into her car, gave Kenji one last, long look and drove away. Kenji shouldered his pack and walked to the truck, the silence between him and Haruto stretching thin as a wire. The drive back to the station was wordless. When they arrived, Haruto led him not to the office but to the main common room. He gestured for Kenji to sit at the table, then went and poured 2 mugs of tea, his movements slow and deliberate. He placed one in front of Kenji and sat down opposite him. The ritual was so familiar, so normal, it felt surreal. I should fire you, Haruto said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, heavy with a weariness that went beyond simple anger. You disobeyed a direct order. You abandoned your post. You took a civilian into a restricted area twice. You lied to me. Give me one reason why your uniform is not in a box by the end of the day. Kenji looked at his chief. He saw the anger, but underneath it, he saw the same deep exhaustion he felt in his own bones. He decided to give Haruto the one thing he had been withholding, the truth, all of it. He started from the beginning. He told him about the unfinished note, the obsession it sparked. He told him about the mimic crows, the sketchbook, the chillingly accurate portraits of the griever. He explained the entity's nature as a psychic predator that fed on sorrow. He described the final confrontation, the ancient monk's book, and the unmaking of the shadow. He laid the entire, insane story out on the table between them, expecting to be met with scorn, with pity, with a call to the nearest psychiatric hospital. As he spoke, he pulled the 2 books from his pack and placed them on the table. The dark, ancient leather of Kokoro no Cage and the modern charcoal gray of the Shadow Catcher. 2 ghosts at a feast. When he finished, the room was quiet save for the hum of the refrigerator. Haruto had not interrupted him once. He just sat and listened, his eyes fixed on Kenji's face, his expression unreadable. Haruto was silent for a full minute after Kenji stopped talking. He reached out a hand, not to the books but to his mug of tea. He took a long, slow sip. 15 years ago, Haruto began, his voice raspy, there was another ranger. His name was Ito. He was like you, talented, empathetic. He felt the forest more than the rest of us. Kenji listened, his breath held. We had a bad year, a lot of bodies, more than usual. Ito started changing. He became withdrawn, paranoid. He claimed something was out here hunting. He called it the Sorrow Eater. He started keeping logs not of his patrols but of its behavior. He said it was learning. He said it was getting stronger. Haruto looked down at his hands wrapped around the warm mug. I thought he was breaking down, PTSD, burnout. I recommended he take a leave. He refused. A week later, he walked into the forest on his day off and never came back. We found his pack a few days later. His service weapon was gone, but there was no body, no note, nothing. He just vanished. Kenji stared at his chief, a cold understanding dawning on him. Ito was the unnamed predecessor from the old maps. He had seen the griever too, and he had lost. You believe me, Kenji said, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. I believe, Haruto said slowly, choosing his words with immense care, that you believe. And I believe that this forest is a sick place. It gets into your head. It finds your weaknesses and it twists them. Whether what you saw was a real demon or one you and that dead poet cooked up in your own minds, the result is the same. It almost destroyed you. It did destroy Ito. He finally looked at the two books on the table. He reached out and with the tip of one finger touched the cover of Ren's sketchbook. So you think you've killed it, Haruto said. We unmade it, Kenji corrected. There's a difference. And what happens now? The forest is suddenly a happy place. People stop coming here to die. No, Kenji admitted, but the predator is gone, the one that hunted them. Haruto leaned back in his chair, a long, weary sigh escaping him. I'm not going to fire you, Kenji. You're a good ranger, and right now, you're the only one who understands the terrain in a way I can't. But you are on thin ice, and you are going to see Dr. Ito twice a month from now on, not once. That is not negotiable. He stood up, the meeting clearly over. As for those, he said, gesturing to the books, they do not stay here. This station is a place of order. Those are agents of chaos. I don't care what you do with them, but get them out of my station. He walked out of the room, leaving Kenji alone with the two books and the ghost of Ranger Ito. He felt a profound sense of relief, but also a new, creeping dread. He had an ally of a sort, but Haruto's story confirmed his deepest fear. The griever had been active for a long time. It had claimed others, and its absence, an absence that powerful must leave a vacuum. Later that evening, Kenji sat in his room, the two books on his small desk. He called Hinata and told her what had happened with Haruto. So he knows, she said. He believes you. He believes something is wrong, Kenji clarified. It's enough for now. What about the books? She asked. I still think they should be destroyed. I don't think we can, Kenji said. There. An immune system, a record of how to fight the sickness. If another griever, another psychic predator ever appears, this is the only guide. So we become librarians of the apocalypse. Her voice was laced with a bitter irony. Keepers of a forgotten horror. We become watchers, Kenji said, the word feeling right true. We watch the forest. We make sure it stays gone. A silence fell between them. The silence of two people bound by a shared, impossible secret. The forest feels different now, Kenji said into the quiet. Since we came back, it's empty. Good, she said. Empty is good. But Kenji wasn't so sure. It wasn't a peaceful emptiness. It was a hollow one. A deep, resonant silence where a monstrous voice used to be. And Kenji knew with the instinct of a hunter who has studied his prey that nature abhors a vacuum. Something else would eventually move in to fill the silence. Or perhaps something that had been there all along, quiet and overlooked, would finally have room to breathe. Chapter 8: The Absence of Echoes. The days that followed were unsettling in their normalcy. The forest fell silent. The oppressive, watchful feeling that had been Kenji's constant companion was gone. The air felt lighter. The perpetual twilight under the canopy seemed a shade brighter. On a patrol with Yumi, He even heard birdsong in a sector that had been dead quiet for years. "See," Yumi said, a rare, genuine smile on her face. "It's just a forest. It has good days and bad days like anything else." Kenji just nodded, but he found no comfort in the change. The silence of the griever had been menacing, but this new silence was unnerving. It was the silence of a house after a violent death, a stillness that felt heavier and more profound than the noise it had replaced. It was an absence. He kept his promise to Haruto and removed the books from the station. He rented a small, secure storage unit in the nearby town, a sterile, climate-controlled box. He placed Kokoro no Cage and the shadow catcher inside, side by side on a metal shelf. It felt like interring two bodies. He stood in the small unit for a long time, the silence of the place a pale imitation of the forest's new quiet. He felt a strange reluctance to leave them, a sense of a shepherd abandoning his most dangerous sheep. Work at the station settled into a grim routine. 2 weeks passed without a single call. No lost hikers, no worried families, no reported campsites. The phone on the wall remained quiet. The colored pins on Haruto's map remained unchanged. "It's a good thing," Haruto said, though he too seemed on edge, packing the common room more than usual. "A quiet stretch. We've earned it." But Kenji knew it wasn't good. The Jukai did not simply go quiet. It was a constant magnet for human despair. The silence was unnatural. It was as if the forest had lost its voice, its ability to call out to the desperate and the lost. Then a call came. A body had been discovered by a group of forestry surveyors. It was deep in a sector rarely visited, far from any established trail. As Kenji, Haruto, and Yumi hiked to the location, Kenji felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He was preparing himself for the familiar signs of the griever's influence, a scene of frantic terror or utter despair. They found the body at the base of an ancient, moss-covered cliff face. The victim was an old man. He was laid out carefully on a bed of ferns, his hands folded peacefully on his chest. His face was calm, his eyes closed. There was no sign of a struggle, no fear etched into his features. He looked as if he had simply fallen asleep. Beside him, a small, worn leather wallet was placed neatly on a rock, open to a faded photograph of a smiling woman. "Looks peaceful," Yumi murmured, a note of surprise in her voice. She began her methodical documentation, but her movements were less brisk than usual. The scene had affected her. Haruto stood silently, his gaze sweeping the area. "No note," he observed. This was what was so deeply wrong. There was always a note, a final, desperate message, a cry of pain, or, in Ren's case, an unfinished question. This man had left only a photograph and an overwhelming sense of peace. It was the most unnatural death scene Kenji had ever witnessed in the Aokigahara. The forest hadn't killed this man with fear or despair. It had killed him with kindness. It had lulled him into a gentle, quiet end. And somehow, that was infinitely more horrifying. Later that night, Kenji called Hinata. He told her about the body, the peaceful expression, the profound wrongness of the scene. "The griever is gone," he said, thinking aloud. "The aggressive despair is gone, so what's left?" "The original sorrow," Hinata replied, her voice distant. She had been spending her time poring over the photographs of the two books, her mind as captivated as his. The griever wasn't the source. It was a predator drawn to the source. The monk's book talks about it. He calls the griever a hungry ghost, but he says it was drawn to a much older, deeper sadness, a foundational echo. Kenji felt a chill. The foundation, the source. They had cut down the rotten tree but had left the roots in the ground. "What else does it say?" he asked. "It doesn't," she said, her voice laced with frustration. The monk describes the griever in detail because it was the active threat, the thing he had to fight. He only mentions the deeper sadness as a kind of emotional bedrock for the forest. He never identifies it. Their investigation had stalled. They had defeated one monster only to discover a deeper, more ephemeral mystery. A few days later, while on a solo patrol of the forest's perimeter, Kenji felt an urge he could not explain. He left the marked trail, his feet carrying him toward a part of the woods he had never explored. He was not guided by a compass or a map, but by a faint, pulling sensation, a gentle tug in his mind. It was not the malevolent lure of the griever, but something softer, more inquisitive. He found himself in a small, ancient grove of Japanese cedars. The trees were enormous, their bark thick and gnarled. The air here was different, older. In the center of the grove, half buried in the moss and dirt at the base of the largest cedar, was a small object. Kenji knelt, his heart pounding with a slow, heavy rhythm. He carefully dug the object out of the earth. It was a child's toy. A small wooden doll, its paint almost completely worn away by time and weather. It was crudely carved, its simple, smiling face now barely visible. It was impossibly old, from another century. He held the doll in the palm of his hand. It felt warm, despite the chill in the air. As he looked at it, he did not feel despair or fear. He felt a wave of emotion so pure and so powerful it made him gasp. Loneliness. A vast, cosmic, soul-deep loneliness. The loneliness of a lost child who has been waiting for centuries to be found. He heard a sound. It was not the wind. It was not an animal. It was the sound of a child weeping softly. The sound was not a mimic. It was not a trick. It was real. It came from the trees, from the earth, from the air itself. The griever had been a monster to be fought. This was a tragedy to be mourned. He had been so focused on the predator that he had never thought to ask what it was preying on. He had found the foundational echo. He had found the heart of the forest's sorrow, and he had no idea what to do. Chapter 9. The Naki-Ko. Kenji stood in the ancient grove, the small wooden doll in his hand, the sound of phantom weeping echoing in his soul. This was the answer that posed 1,000 new questions. He had been fighting a war on the wrong front. The griever was a symptom. This loneliness, this profound, centuries-old grief, was the disease. He did not take the doll. He gently placed it back at the base of the giant cedar, covering it again with moss. It did not belong to him. It did not belong in a storage locker or on an evidence table. It belonged here. It was a tombstone. He made his way out of the grove, the feeling of gentle sorrow following him like a lost dog. He knew he could not solve this mystery with the tools he possessed. Ren's journal and the monk's treatise were guides to fighting a predator. They had no instructions for comforting a ghost. There was only one person who might have an answer. The next day, he drove to the small, dilapidated Shinto shrine that stood guard at the forest's edge. He had not spoken to Master Taikda, the shrine's elderly keeper, in years. Haruto treated the old man with a wary respect, but Kenji had always dismissed him as a relic, a purveyor of folk tales in a world that demanded practical solutions. Now, he was desperate for a folk tale. He found Master Taikda sweeping fallen leaves from the stone path with a bamboo broom. The old man was small and wizened, his movements slow but full of a serene grace. He stopped his sweeping as Kenji approached and looked at him, his dark eyes surprisingly sharp and perceptive. He did not seem surprised to see him. "The forest is quiet," Master Taikda said, his voice a dry rustle like the leaves at his feet. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes," Kenji replied, "too quiet." "You have disturbed the balance, Tanaka-san," the old man said, leaning on his broom. "You chased away the wolf, but you did not calm the lamb that drew it." Kenji was stunned into silence. "You know, my family has watched this forest for 300 years, Master Taikda said. We do not see everything, but we feel the currents. A hungry ghost has been banished. I have not felt its presence for weeks, but the old sorrow, the deep sorrow, it is now unobscured. It is reaching out." He looked Kenji directly in the eye. "It has touched you." Kenji pulled up a small wooden stool and sat. He told the old man everything, holding nothing back. He spoke of the griever, the books, the peaceful man on the bed of ferns, and finally, the wooden doll and the overwhelming loneliness. Master Taikda listened patiently, his expression never changing. When Kenji was finished, the old man nodded slowly. "You have met the Nakiko," he said, "the crying child. She is the true spirit of this place, the first ghost." He told Kenji the story, a legend passed down through his family for generations. 3 centuries ago, a small village had stood near where the shrine now was. During a harsh winter famine, a little girl had wandered into the woods searching for firewood or food and had gotten lost. Her parents and the entire village searched for days, but they never found her. She died alone in the cold, her heart broken not by fear, but by the sorrow of being lost and forgotten. Her spirit did not pass on, Master Taikda continued. Her loneliness was so powerful, so pure, that it stained the forest itself. It became the bedrock you spoke of. For centuries, she was just a sad echo, a cold spot in the woods, a sound of weeping on the wind. Unhappy but harmless. "What changed?" Kenji asked. "The world changed," the old man said with a sigh. People began to bring their own new sorrows into her home, the suicides. Each one was a fresh wound, a new voice of pain added to her chorus. Her simple loneliness became a complex symphony of despair. And that symphony, that great noise of human misery, attracted predators. "The griever," Kenji breathed. "And others before it and others like it," Taikda confirmed. "Hungry ghosts drawn to the feast. The Nakiko was the bait and the desperate who sought out the forest were the prey. The griever was just the latest and most powerful of these parasites. By unmaking it, you have done a good thing. You have cleansed the wound of its infection, but the wound itself remains." "The peaceful man," Kenji started. The Nakiko is not malevolent, Takedo explained. She is a child. She does not understand the complexities of adult despair. She only understands loneliness. She felt the old man's loneliness and she reached out to it. She offered him the only comfort she knows, a quiet, shared solitude, an end to the pain of being alone. The horrifying truth settled over Kenji. The forest was now more dangerous, in a subtle, insidious way than ever before. The griever offered a terrifying death. The Nakiko offered a gentle, seductive one. How could you fight an enemy that only wanted to comfort you? What do we do? Kenji asked, his voice filled with the weight of this new, impossible responsibility. How do you fight a ghost like that? You do not fight her, Master Takeda said, shaking his head. You cannot. Her grief is now part of the soil, part of the trees. To destroy her would be to destroy the forest itself. She is not a monster to be slain. Then what? The old man looked toward the dark tree line, his expression one of deep, ancient sadness. She is a lost child, and a lost child needs only one thing. To be found, Kenji whispered, the words tasting like a premonition. She must be guided home, Takeda said. Her spirit must be shown the path it lost centuries ago. A ritual must be performed, a ceremony of passage. It is a difficult, dangerous rite. It requires a guide who can walk in the world of spirits without becoming lost themselves. It requires a heart strong enough to withstand her sorrow without breaking. He turned his piercing gaze back to Kenji. The forest has been testing you, Tanaka-san. It has been preparing you. The griever was your trial by fire. Now the true task begins. Kenji left the shrine as the sun began to set, the sky turning a bruised purple and orange. The horror he had felt before, the fear of a monster, was gone. It was replaced by a sense of profound, tragic purpose. This was not a hunt. It was a rescue mission, centuries overdue. He drove back toward the station, his mind reeling. He had to tell Haruto. He had to tell Hinata. This was not over. The final chapter of the forest story had not yet been written. As he pulled into the station's lot, he saw Haruto and Yumi standing by the main door, their postures tense. Haruto was holding the receiver of the station's phone, the cord stretched taut. "What is it?" Kenji asked, getting out of his truck. "A call," Yumi said, her face pale. "From a woman in Tokyo, Mizushima Hinata." A cold dread seized Kenji. "Is she okay?" Haruto shook his head, his face grim. "She went to visit her father this afternoon. He wasn't answering the door. She let herself in. He's gone." "Gone where?" Kenji asked, though he already knew the answer. "He left a note on the kitchen table," Haruto said, his voice heavy. It had one sentence. He looked Kenji in the eye, and Kenji saw a flicker of shared, terrified understanding. The note said, "I'm going to the forest. A little girl is lost, and I have to help her find her way home." Chapter 10, The Last Patrol. The news of Hinata's father hit the small station like a physical shockwave. The air crackled with a sudden, terrible urgency. The quiet, philosophical horror of the past few weeks had just transformed into a frantic, ticking clock. A man's life was on the line. Get the maps for the southern sectors, Haruto barked at Yumi, his voice a low, controlled growl. He was back in his element, a crisis manager taking charge. The supernatural ambiguity was gone, replaced by a tangible objective: find the man. I want thermal scans of every trail leading from his last known location. Check his car's GPS history. We need a search grid now. Kenji watched him, a cold calm settling over his own panic. Haruto was preparing for a standard search and rescue. He was mobilizing for a fight against terrain, weather, and time. But Kenji knew they were fighting a ghost. Haruto, Kenji said, his voice cutting through the chief's rapid-fire orders. A standard grid search won't work. Haruto turned, his face a mask of impatience. This is not the time for your theories, Kenji. A man is missing. He is not missing, Kenji countered, his voice steady. He has been called. He is walking toward the Nakiko, toward the grove. He is on a direct path. We don't need a grid, we need a straight line. We follow procedure, Haruto snapped. It's what we do. The phone rang again. Yumi answered it, her face pale. It's Mizushima-san, she said, her voice trembling slightly. She's on her way. She's driving from Tokyo. Tell her to stay put, Haruto ordered. She's a civilian. She will only get in the way. No, Kenji said, stepping forward. The two men were now face to face, the tension between them a palpable force. She's the key. Her father is being drawn in by a ghost that feeds on family grief. She's not a civilian. She's the only weapon we have that it might recognize. Haruto stared at him, his jaw working silently. Kenji could see the war in his eyes, the lifetime of procedure battling against the undeniable, insane truth of the past few weeks. The story of Ranger Ito, the griever, the peaceful man on the bed of ferns. The patterns were all there, and Haruto was too good a ranger not to see them. This is insane, Haruto breathed. But the fire in his voice was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. Yes, Kenji agreed. Welcome to the job. An hour later, Hinata's car skidded into the gravel lot. She burst out, her face a mess of tear-streaked fury. She was no longer the determined survivor from the forest. She was a daughter who was being forced to watch her family be consumed, piece by piece. My father, she said, her voice raw. Where is he? We're going to find him, Kenji promised. He laid out his plan. It was simple, reckless, and based entirely on the supernatural. He and Hinata would go directly to the grove. Haruto and Yumi would run a parallel search, following procedure, acting as their backup and their link to the rational world. You are not going alone, Haruto stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. I'm coming with you. Yumi, you coordinate from the station. If we are not back by dawn, you call in the prefectural police and you tell them everything. You show them the books. He looked at the storage unit key on Kenji's desk. It was an enormous concession, an admission that the world was no longer what he thought it was. They geared up in silence. The equipment felt different this time. The headlamps, the ropes, the first aid kits, they all seemed like children's toys in the face of what they were confronting. Kenji took one more thing. He went to his locker and retrieved the small, leather-bound journal written by Ren Mizushima. He tucked it into his jacket. A brother's words might be the only thing that could reach a father. The four of them, Kenji, Haruto, and Hinata, stepped into the forest as dusk began to bleed through the trees. The air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth. The forest was preternaturally quiet. There were no birds, no wind, no sounds of life. The silence was not empty, it was expectant. They moved quickly, Kenji in the lead, navigating by instinct and the faint, pulling sensation in his mind. Haruto followed, his hand resting on the GPS unit on his belt, a man caught between two worlds. Hinata was behind him, her movements driven by a frantic, desperate energy. As they went deeper, the character of the forest began to change. The gentle, ambient sadness Kenji had felt before was now more focused, more concentrated. It was a low, psychic hum that vibrated in their bones. Kenji felt memories of his own past failures surface unbidden. The face of a hiker he had found too late, a sharp word to his own father years ago. He pushed them away, recognizing them as the forest's subtle attack. He glanced back at Haruto. The chief's face was grim, his brow furrowed. He was feeling it too. His professional armor was being eroded by the constant, gentle pressure of sorrow. It was Hinata who was in the most danger. She stumbled, her breath catching in her throat. "What is it?" Kenji asked, stopping. "I heard her," Hinata whispered, her eyes wide. "My mother, she died when I was a teenager. I heard her voice calling my name." "It's a lie, Hinata," Kenji said, his voice firm. "It's an echo. It's using your memories, your grief. It's trying to distract you. Focus on your father." She nodded, her jaw tight, and pushed onward. But the attack had taken its toll. The forest now knew her specific weaknesses. They found the first sign an hour later. It was a man's coat, neatly folded and placed on a low-hanging branch, as if he no longer felt the cold. A short distance away, they found his wallet placed on a rock, as if he no longer had need for an identity. He was shedding his life, piece by piece, as he walked toward his final, peaceful purpose. Night fell. They switched on their headlamps, their powerful beams cutting sharp, lonely tunnels through the oppressive darkness. The psychic hum of sorrow grew stronger, and now, underneath it, they could all hear it. The faint, unmistakable sound of a child weeping. The sound came from all around them, a disembodied lament that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. But as they walked, it began to resolve, to come from a single direction. It was pulling them forward. "We're close," Kenji said. The air had grown cold, the kind of deep, unnatural chill that precedes a frost. He could see his breath misting in the beam of his headlamp. They broke through a final, dense thicket of bamboo and stepped into the grove of ancient cedars. The sight that met them stopped them dead in their tracks. The grove was bathed in a soft, ethereal, silvery light that seemed to have no source. In the center of the grove, at the base of the great cedar, sat Mr. Mizushima. He was cross-legged on the moss, his back to them. He was not moving, but they could hear him. He was humming a soft, gentle lullaby. In his hands he cradled the small, ancient wooden doll. And sitting before him, visible not as a true physical form but as a shimmering distortion in the air, was the translucent figure of a small girl in an old-fashioned kimono. Her form was woven from moonlight and sorrow. She was not crying anymore. She was listening to the lullaby, her ghostly head tilted, her expression one of rapt attention. Mr. Mizushima had found the Nakiko, and he was comforting her. He was giving her the peace he could not find in his own life, a final act of paternal love for a ghost who was not his daughter. He was willingly giving his life force, his warmth, to soothe a pain that was centuries old. And the Nakiko was accepting it, draining him dry with the innocent, unthinking selfishness of a child. Chapter 11. The Guiding Light. The scene in the grove was so profoundly strange, so tragically peaceful that it paralyzed them. Haruto raised a hand, a silent command to halt, his training taking over. His eyes scanned the situation, trying to process it through the lens of a rescuer. Hostage situation, psychotic break, neither term fit. Mr. Mizushima continued to hum, his voice growing fainter, weaker. The silvery form of the Nakiko seemed to grow a fraction more solid, more defined, drawing its substance from his fading life. He was a candle burning down to warm a phantom. "We have to get him out of there," Haruto whispered, his voice tight. "If we rush in, we could break the connection," Kenji countered, his mind racing, trying to recall Master Takeda's words. "The shock could kill him, or she might react." "She," Haruto hissed, his skepticism warring with the impossible sight before him. "The ghost, Haruto, the little girl he's singing to." Hinata took a step forward, her face a canvas of anguish. "Papa," she called out, her voice breaking. At the sound of her voice, her father did not stir, but the shimmering form of the Nakiko turned its head. It had no discernible features, but they all felt its attention shift to them. A wave of pure, unadulterated loneliness washed over the group, 100 times more powerful than before. It was a child's desolation at being interrupted, at the fear of being left alone again. Haruto staggered back, his face paling, his hand going to his chest. Even he could not stand against the raw force of this emotion. Hinata choked back a sob, her legs buckling. Kenji fought it. He focused on the doll, on the story Takeda had told him. She is a lost child. She needs to be guided home. This was not a banishment. It was an intervention, an exorcism of grief. "Hinata," Kenji said, his voice urgent, grabbing her arm to steady her. "Don't call to him, call to her. She's the one we need to reach." "What?" she gasped, confused. "She's lost. She doesn't know the way home. Your father is just a temporary comfort, a borrowed warmth. We have to show her the real path." He pulled Ren's journal from his jacket. "Your family is bound to this. Your brother tried to understand it. Your father is trying to soothe it. You have to be the one to end it." He opened the journal and thrust it into her hands. "Read to her," he commanded. "Read what?" "Anything. One of Ren's poems. Let her hear her friend's voice. Let her know she's not alone in her darkness." Hinata stared at him, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Then she looked at her father, whose humming was now little more than a faint, wheezing breath. She saw his life fading away. Her resolve hardened. She opened the journal, her fingers tracing her brother's familiar handwriting. Her headlamp illuminated the page. She found the poem Ren had written in his final hours, the poem about the color of silence. Her voice was shaky at first, a trembling whisper in the enchanted grove. "The silence has a color here," she began. The Nakiko stilled, its form turning completely toward her. Mr. Mizushima's humming stopped. Hinata's voice grew stronger, clearer, filled with the weight of her own grief and love. She was not just reading a poem, she was delivering a eulogy, a message from one lost soul to another. As she read, Kenji stepped forward, moving slowly, deliberately, toward the great cedar tree. Haruto watched him, his expression a mixture of terror and awe. "Kenji, what are you doing?" "I'm making a doorway," Kenji said, his eyes never leaving the ghost child. He remembered the monk's words from the book. The shadow fears the light, not the light of the sun, but the light of a will that refuses to be broken. He reached the tree, standing between Mr. Mizushima and the ghost. He closed his eyes. He did not try to fight the sorrow. He let it wash over him through him. He accepted it. He felt the child's centuries of loneliness, the pain of being forgotten. But he did not let it consume him. He held onto his own center, his own identity as a rescuer, a guide. He became a lighthouse in a sea of despair. He held out his hand, palm open, toward the Nakiko. "It's time to go home," he said, his voice soft but firm, filled with an empathy so profound it was a physical force. "Your parents are waiting. They never stopped looking for you." The shimmering form of the child drifted toward him, drawn by his warmth, his certainty. It was hesitant, shy. Hinata's voice reached the end of the poem, the final words hanging in the air like a prayer. The Nakiko reached out a small, translucent hand and almost touched Kenji. In that moment, Hinata did something extraordinary. She stopped reading her brother's words and began to speak her own. "I forgive you," she said to the ghost, tears streaming down her face. "You took them. You took my brother and you tried to take my father, but you didn't do it out of malice. You did it out of pain. I forgive you." It was the one emotion the forest had never known. Not sorrow, not fear, not anger, not even peace. Forgiveness. It was a complex human grace that had no place in this elemental world of grief. The effect was instantaneous. When the Nakiko's phantom fingers touched Kenji's, a brilliant, warm, golden light erupted from the point of contact. It was not a harsh light, but a gentle, welcoming glow that filled the entire grove, pushing back the shadows. The oppressive cold vanished, replaced by a profound warmth. The ghost child looked up, and for a single, fleeting second she had a face. A real face. A little girl with wide, curious eyes, and she was smiling. Then her form dissolved into 1,000 motes of golden light, like fireflies, which swirled upwards and vanished into the canopy of the great cedar. The light faded. The weeping was gone. The sorrow was gone. The deep psychic pressure that had defined the Aokigahara for centuries simply ceased to exist. Mr. Mizushima slumped sideways, the wooden doll falling from his hands and crumbling into a fine, gray dust. Haruto rushed forward, checking his pulse. "He's alive," the chief said, his voice choked with emotion. "Weak, but he's alive." Kenji fell to his knees, utterly drained, the world swimming before his eyes. The effort had taken everything he had. Hinata ran to her father's side, cradling his head in her lap. her own sobs now not of grief, but of relief. They had done it. They had rescued the man, and in doing so they had rescued the forest from itself. The last patrol was over. Chapter 12. The Keepers of the Silence. Getting Mr. Mizashima out of the forest was a grueling physical task that served as a grounding wire back to reality. He was alive but non-responsive, lost in a deep, healing sleep. Kenji and Haruto carried him on a makeshift stretcher, their muscles burning, their minds numb. Hinata walked beside them, her hand never leaving her father's. The forest they walked through was not the one they had entered. The silence was different now. It was not the menacing silence of the griever, nor the sorrowful silence of the Nakiko. It was just silence, the clean, neutral quiet of woods in the deep of night. The oppressive weight was gone, the air light and breathable. For the first time in his career, Kenji felt like he was simply walking through a collection of trees. They emerged from the trailhead just as the first hint of dawn was painting the eastern sky a pale, washed-out gray. Yumi was waiting, her face etched with worry, a thermos of hot tea ready. The sight of the rescue team, exhausted but whole with their charge alive, brought tears to her eyes. The aftermath was a blur of official procedure. An ambulance arrived, taking Mr. Mizashima to the nearest hospital. He would wake up hours later with a severe case of exhaustion and hypothermia, and no memory of the past 24 hours beyond leaving his home. The doctors would call it a fugue state, a temporary amnesia brought on by extreme grief and stress. It was a neat, rational explanation, and one they all tacitly agreed to accept. Back at the station, the four of them sat around the communal table, the rising sun casting long shadows into the room. No one spoke for a long time. They were four people who had shared an experience that no one else in the world would ever understand. They were members of a club of one. Haruto finally broke the silence. He looked at Kenji, his eyes filled with a new, profound respect that went beyond that of a chief to his subordinate. "The logbook," he said, his voice raspy with fatigue. "You need to write it all down, everything you know, everything you learned. The griever, the Nakiko, the books, all of it. Not for the police, for us. For the next person who has to stand watch." It was the ultimate validation. Haruto was not just acknowledging the truth, he was archiving it. He was making it part of the station's official, secret history. Kenji nodded, "I will." Over the next few weeks, life found a new, quieter rhythm. Kenji began the logbook, a new journal bound not in cheap leather but in sturdy, official canvas. He chronicled the entire story, detailing the nature of the psychic entities, the methods of fighting them, and the final, impossible rescue. It was a grim, strange document, part ranger's log, part field guide to metaphysics, part ghost story. Hinata and her father returned to Tokyo. Mr. Mizashima made a full physical recovery, though the holes in his memory remained. He and his daughter began the slow, difficult process of grieving for Ren together, their shared loss no longer haunted by a supernatural malignancy. Hinata called Kenji once a week. They did not speak of what happened. They spoke of the weather, of work, of her father's progress. They were quiet conversations, filled with the unspoken understanding of soldiers who had survived the same war. The forest remained quiet. People still came, drawn by its grim reputation, and the S&R team still had a job to do. But the work was different. The bodies they found were simple, tragic ends, no longer tinged with an aura of unnatural despair or seductive peace. The Jukai had been rendered toothless. It was just a place again. One crisp autumn afternoon, Master Takeda visited the station. He and Kenji sat outside, drinking tea and watching the sun set over the now placid sea of trees. "The air is clean," the old man said. "The child's spirit is at rest. You have done a great thing, Tanaka-san." "I had help," Kenji said, thinking of Hinata's courage and Haruto's reluctant faith. "The forest chose you as its guide," Takeda said, "and now your work is done." He looked at Kenji, his eyes searching. But a man who has learned to see ghosts can never truly unsee them. The world is full of other quiet, wounded places. Your path may lead you away from here. Kenji considered his words. He knew the old man was right. He had been changed. He had looked behind the veil of the world and could never fully return. But as he looked at the station, at Haruto cleaning a rifle inside, at Yumi filing paperwork, he felt a sense of belonging. "My place is here," Kenji said, a quiet certainty in his voice. "The forest is quiet, but someone needs to be here to listen to the silence." He had found his purpose. He was no longer just a rescuer of bodies. He was a keeper of the silence, a watcher on the walls of a place that had once been a gateway to hell. He, along with Haruto, Yumi, and a woman in Tokyo, were the secret guardians of a peace won at a terrible cost. The story of the Aokigahara was over, but his had just begun. Chapter 13. The Geometry of Scars. 6 months passed. Winter seized the Aokigahara, burying its secrets under a thick blanket of snow. The silence held. It was a clean, cold silence, stripped of the sorrow that had been its voice for so long. The S&R station settled into a rhythm of quiet vigilance. The calls that came were blessedly mundane. Hikers with twisted ankles, cars broken down on the icy access roads. The forest's grim reputation still drew the curious and the morbid, but the desperate, the ones who had once heard its siren song of despair, seemed to no longer find their way there. The magnet had lost its pull. Kenji became the station's reluctant archivist. In the long, quiet evenings, he worked on the new logbook. It was a secret history, its canvas cover stark and anonymous. He filled its pages with his neat, precise script, detailing the griever's habits, the nature of the Nakiko's sorrow, and the final, impossible ritual that had brought the peace. He included photocopies of Ren's charcoal drawings and translated passages from the monk's ancient text. It was a grim and terrible encyclopedia, and Haruto read every new entry, his face a stony mask that did not hide the deep-seated unease in his eyes. Kenji had been changed. Master Takeda's words had proven true. He could not unsee the world's ghosts. He felt the emotional landscape of a place as keenly as he felt the wind on his face. He was more attuned, more sensitive, and the forest's new silence was a constant source of unnerving study. It was too perfect, too complete. The first sign that something was wrong was small, almost laughably so. On a solo patrol along the northern perimeter, Kenji came across a clearing blanketed in fresh, untouched snow. In the center of the clearing was a perfect circle, 10 feet in diameter. It was not a depression or a marking in the snow. It was composed of hundreds of fallen brown leaves, arranged in a flawless geometric shape on top of the snow. They were sorted by size, the smallest leaves at the center, spiraling outwards to the largest at the perimeter. Kenji stood and stared, a cold feeling unrelated to the winter air creeping up his spine. No wind, no animal, no human could have created such a thing. It was an act of impossible, meticulous order. It was not frightening. It was not sorrowful. It was simply profoundly wrong. He took a photo with his phone, then, with the toe of his boot, he disturbed the perfect pattern, the act feeling like a small sacrilege. He mentioned it to Haruto, who dismissed it as a strange wind vortex. But Kenji saw the flicker of doubt in his chief's eyes. They were both becoming connoisseurs of the unnatural, and this did not fit the profile of their old enemy. A week later, Yumi called him into the comms room, her expression baffled. She pointed to her monitor, which displayed a live feed from a high-altitude weather drone. It was surveying the forest canopy. "Look at this," she said, zooming in on a specific sector. "The migratory patterns are off, way off." On the screen, a flock of dusky thrushes was flying over the forest. But they were not flying in a loose, organic V formation. They were flying in a perfect, rigid grid, spaced with mathematical precision, their wings beating in uncanny synchronicity. They looked less like birds and more like pixels on a screen. "I've checked the drone's sensors, the lens. There are no glitches," Yumi said, her voice a mixture of technical frustration and nascent fear. "That's what they're actually doing." Kenji watched the impossible squadron fly until it was out of frame. The Griever had been a creature of chaos and emotion. This was something else entirely. This was the work of a cold, unfeeling, and deeply alien intelligence. The sorrow had been replaced by a logic that defied nature. He drove to the shrine that evening. He found Master Taekta feeding the koi in his small, frozen pond, breaking the ice with a small hammer. "The patterns have returned," the old man said without looking up, as if continuing a conversation they had already been having. "I don't understand," Kenji said. "I thought the forest was healed." "You healed its heart," Taekta corrected, scattering food into the icy water. "But you have forgotten the nature of this place. The Jukai is not a normal forest. It grows on a bed of volcanic rock, metal-rich, a place of strange magnetic fields and geological anomalies. It is a weak spot, a scar on the skin of the world." He finally turned to face Kenji, his eyes dark with a new kind of worry. The Nakiko's grief for all the horror it caused was a shield. It was a blanket of profound, chaotic human emotion. It filled this place with psychic noise, drowning out everything else. It kept the forest's true nature dormant. "Its true nature. This place is not meant to be empty," Taekta said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It is a vessel. You have emptied it of its sorrow, and now something else is beginning to seep in to fill the void. Or perhaps something that was always here, sleeping beneath the grief, is finally waking up." A new dread, colder and more profound than any fear of ghosts, settled in Kenji's gut. They had not cleansed the forest. They had merely sterilized it, making it a pristine and welcoming environment for a new, unknown form of contagion. The logbook on his desk was useless. It was a history of a vanquished enemy. They were facing something new, something that had no name, no form, no discernible motive beyond the imposition of a terrifying, unnatural order. He was driving back to the station, his mind reeling when his phone rang. It was Yumi, and her voice was tight with panic. "Kenji, you need to get back here. We just got a call. A car has been found, abandoned at the trailhead to Sector 9. "A jumper?" Kenji asked, the old terminology feeling alien on his tongue. "No," Yumi said, and the word was sharp with fear. "The police ran the plates. The car belongs to a man named Dr. Kaito Eiji, a professor of theoretical mathematics and physics from Kyoto University. One of the responding officers looked him up. Kenji. He's a famous paranormal researcher, and his blog's latest entry from 2 days ago is titled, 'The Aokigahara Null Point, a perfect conduit for interdimensional signal propagation.'" Chapter 14, The Null Point. Dr. Kaito's car was a late-model, anonymous gray sedan, a stark piece of modern machinery against the ancient backdrop of the forest. It was parked neatly in the small lot, locked. A light dusting of snow on the windshield indicated it had been there for at least a day. Haruto was already on scene, speaking with the 2 local police officers who had made the initial discovery. "Anything?" Kenji asked as he approached, his breath plumbing in the frigid air. Haruto shook his head, his expression grim. "The car is clean. No note, no signs of a struggle. They're getting a warrant to open it." He pulled Kenji aside, lowering his voice. "A mathematics professor. What in the hell is a mathematics professor doing out here?" "He's not here for the trees," Kenji said, a deep sense of foreboding settling over him. "He's here for the silence." He explained what Takeda had told him, the theory of the forest as a sterilized vessel, a clean slate. As he spoke, he saw the look on Haruto's face shift from weary frustration to dawning horror. The chief was beginning to understand. They had not ended the threat, they had upgraded it. The warrant came through electronically. One of the officers used a slim jim to open the car door. The interior was pristine save for the passenger seat, where a high-end laptop sat open. Yumi, who had arrived just after Kenji, immediately gravitated to it, her technical expertise overriding her fear. "He left it on," she murmured, her fingers flying over the trackpad. "The battery is almost dead." The screen was filled with complex equations, waveform diagrams, and pages of dense, typed notes. Yumi's eyes scanned the text, her expression growing more and more alarmed. "My God," she whispered. "He's not a ghost hunter. He's a theorist. He believes that certain geological locations, places with unique magnetic and mineral properties, can act as natural amplifiers for signals that are not from around here." "What kind of signals?" Haruto asked, leaning in. "He calls it background radiation from adjacent realities," Yumi read, her voice trembling slightly. "He says that usually the psychic noise of a location, the bioelectric fields of plants, animals, people, scrambles the signal. But his research detected a sudden and inexplicable null point here. a zone of absolute psychic and energetic silence that appeared 6 months ago. He called it the most important discovery of the century. Kenji felt his blood run cold. Their victory, their hard-won peace, had put a signpost up for a completely different kind of predator. They had muted the radio, allowing a deeper, stranger station to be heard. He wasn't just here to listen, Yumi said, pointing to a diagram on the screen. He built something. He calls it a harmonic resonator. It's not meant to receive a signal, it's meant to broadcast one. A simple, pure mathematical waveform. He wanted to see if something would broadcast back. He thought he was knocking on the door of another dimension. "The fool," Haruto growled. "He's not knocking on a door. He's ringing a dinner bell in the middle of the ocean." A search of the trunk confirmed their fears. It was filled with customized electronic equipment, a portable signal generator, solar panels, sensor arrays, and spools of cable. But the equipment was gone. Kaido had taken it with him. "We have to find him," Kenji said, his voice low and urgent. "We have to stop him." The search was unlike any they had ever conducted. There was no grief to follow, no trail of human despair. Kenji tried to feel for a psychic pull, but the forest was a void. The silence was absolute. He was navigationally blind. It was Yumi, with her technology, who found the first clue. She had deployed a small, handheld thermal imager. "This is impossible," she said, staring at the device's screen. "The ambient temperature is -2 degrees, but the ground right here. It's showing a perfect equilateral triangle, each side exactly 3 meters long, and its temperature is exactly 0 degrees. Not -2, 0. It's a thermal anomaly with geometric precision." They all looked at the snow-covered ground. There was nothing there, but the imager showed a perfect, invisible triangle, slightly warmer than its surroundings. "He's leaving a trail," Kenji realized, "or it is." They began to follow the anomalies. Every 50 meters, Yumi's imager would find another perfect shape. A square, a pentagon, a golden spiral laid out on the forest floor, invisible to the naked eye but clear as day in the thermal spectrum. The intelligence they were tracking did not communicate with emotion, but with pure, cold mathematics. It was leaving breadcrumbs of impossible order. The trail led them deeper into the forest, into a sector that was a cartographical blank. The trees here were older, larger, and had a strange, fluted look to their bark, like melted wax. The air grew still, and the silence was so profound that Kenji could hear the blood pulsing in his own ears. Then they heard a sound. It was not a natural sound. It was a low, pure, electronic tone, a perfect sine wave pulsing at a steady rhythm. It was the sound of Dr. Kaido's signal generator. The sound of a man knocking on a door that should never, ever be answered. They followed the sound, their pace quickening. They broke through a curtain of hanging moss and entered a clearing they had never seen before. Kenji felt his breath catch in his throat. The clearing was a scene of utter wrongness. The ground was not covered in snow, but in a strange, gray, fibrous fungus that pulsed with a faint inner light. The trees at the edge of the clearing did not grow upwards. Their trunks were bent into perfect 90-degree angles, forming a square perimeter. In the center of it all stood Dr. Kaido. He was a small, neat man in his 50s, wearing expensive hiking gear. He was surrounded by his electronic equipment, which was all wired to the signal generator that pulsed with its steady, electronic heartbeat. He was not looking at them. He was staring, with an expression of ecstatic, triumphant rapture, at a point in the air directly in front of him. At that point, the air itself seemed to be tearing. It was not a hole or a vortex. It was a shimmering, vertical line like a crack in a pane of glass. But the crack was not in glass. It was in the very fabric of the world. And from within the crack there was no light or darkness, just a profound and absolute nothing. It was an absence that was so complete it felt like a presence. "Dr. Kaito," Haruto yelled, his voice sounding small and thin in the unnaturally quiet clearing. Kaito turned his head, a wide, manic grin on his face. "You see," he cried, his voice giddy with discovery. "It's beautiful," they answered. "They're logical, they're pure." As he spoke, the electronic pulse from his generator faltered for a second. The vertical crack in reality shimmered, and a new sound emerged from it. It was a chittering, clicking sound like 1,000 insects, but it was organized, patterned. It was a language made of static. And a thin, black, thread-like tendril, as sharp and thin as a surgeon's wire, snaked out of the crack. It moved with an impossible, jerky speed and wrapped around the signal generator. There was a fizz of sparks, and the pulsing tone died. The tendril retracted, the chittering stopped, the crack in the air remained. Kaido's ecstatic expression collapsed into one of confusion, then terror. "No," he stammered. "Wait, that's not. The signal must be maintained." He reached for the generator, trying to restart it. But before he could touch it, the trees at the edge of the clearing began to move. Their 90-degree angled trunks began to unfold, to straighten, not like living wood, but like the articulated limbs of an enormous insect. The very geometry of the clearing was reconfiguring itself, closing in on them. The griever had wanted to consume their sorrow. This new thing, this intelligence from beyond the crack, seemed to want to do something far worse. It wanted to correct what it saw as an error. It wanted to edit them and the world they stood in out of existence. Chapter 15. The Unwritten. The forest folded in on itself. The angled trees that formed the clearing's perimeter straightened and bent with the sickening, silent precision of a complex machine. The square clearing warped, its corners pulling inward, the space they stood in shrinking second by second. It was a prison redesigning its own walls. "What is happening?" Yumi cried, her scientific mind unable to process the blatant violation of physics. "It's rewriting the space," Kenji yelled, his mind grasping for an explanation, however insane. Kaido's signal was an invitation. Now it's redecorating. Dr. Kaido, his academic triumph curdled into raw terror, scrambled away from the silent crack in reality. "This is not right," he gibbered, his eyes wide with madness. "The response should be symmetrical. This is a chaotic variable." "You're the chaotic variable," Haruto roared, drawing the heavy-duty flare gun from his belt. It was a tool for signaling, not a weapon, but it was the only thing he had that felt remotely like one. "You opened a door you can't close." Haruto fired the flare gun. The brilliant red projectile shot not at the crack, but at one of the warping trees. It hit the trunk with a loud thwump and exploded in a shower of magnesium-white fire. The effect was not what he intended. The tree did not burn, the fire did not spread. Instead, the section of the trunk hit by the flare simply vanished. It was not destroyed or consumed. It was deleted, leaving a perfectly smooth, cauterized hole in the wood. The tree did not fall or splinter. It continued its impossible reconfiguration as if the hole wasn't there. It's editing, Kenji realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach. It treats damage as an error in the code and just deletes it. They were trapped. Physical force was useless. They were facing an intelligence whose fundamental operating system was different from their own. It didn't fight, it corrected. It didn't kill, it erased. The clicking, chittering language started again, this time not from the crack, but from all around them, as if the trees themselves were speaking. The gray, poolsing fungus on the ground began to creep up their boots, not like a plant, but like a rising tide of static. Hinata, who had been silent until now, her shock rendering her immobile, suddenly called out. She was not with them. During the initial chaos, she had run to her father, who stood frozen, a vacant look on his face. The events were too much for his still healing mind. "He's not responding," she cried. "It's like he's not even here." Kenji looked over. Mr. Mizushima's edges seemed to be blurring, his form losing its sharpness, as if he were a photograph slowly fading in the sun. The entity was starting with him, the weakest, most fragile consciousness in the clearing. It was unwriting him. Kenji's mind raced, desperately trying to find a weapon, a strategy. The griever was fought with emotion. The Nakiko was soothed with empathy. How do you fight a living equation? How do you reason with a glitch in the world? You can't fight it, he thought. You can't reason with it. You have to crash the system. He looked at the silent, vertical tear in the air. It was a doorway, a wound. He looked at Kaido's dead signal generator. The doctor had sent a pure, logical signal through, a mathematical key. The response had been logical until it was interrupted. It needed a signal. But what if they sent it one it couldn't process? What if they sent it something utterly illogical, something chaotic and human and broken? He grabbed Ren's journal from his jacket. He ripped out a handful of pages, the poems written in the grip of despair, the frantic drawings of the griever, the final, unfinished sentence. He ran to Kaido, who was now huddled on the ground, weeping. "How do you turn it on?" Kenji demanded, shaking the man. "How do you make it broadcast?" "It's broken," Kaido wailed. "No, it is," Yumi shouted from across the clearing. She was on her knees beside the generator, her hands flying over its interface. The tendril only fried the primary power relay. There's a backup battery, but the input is gone. It has no signal to send. "We'll give it one," Kenji said. He turned to Yumi. "Can you feed an audio signal into it, a microphone?" Yumi's eyes widened as she understood. "Yes, there's an auxiliary audio port, a diagnostic input." The clearing was shrinking faster, the geometric trees now only a few yards away. The chittering grew louder, more insistent. Haruto fired another flare, erasing another chunk of a tree, buying them a few precious seconds. Kenji ripped the small microphone from his radio harness and handed the wire to Yumi. She jammed it into the port on the generator. "It's connected," she yelled. "The system is ready to broadcast whatever it hears." Kenji knelt in the strange, pulsing fungus. He held the microphone in one hand and the torn pages of Ren's journal in the other. He looked at Hinata, who was holding her fatting father, her face a mask of desperate hope. "Read with me," he commanded. He began to read. He read Ren Mizushima's poems of sorrow, his voice raw and filled with emotion. He described the charcoal drawings of the griever, the faceless avatar of despair. He shouted the monk's fearful prayers from Kokoro no Cage. Hinata joined in, her voice a grief-stricken harmony, reading the words her brother had written as he died. They were not sending a pure sine wave. They were broadcasting a signal of pure, chaotic human pain. They were screaming their grief, their fear, their defiance, their sorrow into the microphone. They were transmitting the messy, illogical, broken code of the human heart directly into the sterile, logical void. The effect was catastrophic. The chittering sound faltered, becoming discordant, arrhythmic. The pulsing of the fungus on the ground sped up, flashing erratically. The steady, geometric movement of the trees stuttered, their limbs twitching and spasming. The vertical crack in the air began to vibrate violently. It widened, and for the first time they could see what was inside. Not a place, but a state of being. An endless, silent vista of perfect, crystalline structures. A cityscape of pure logic, beautiful and utterly terrifying in its absolute perfection. They were poisoning it. Their chaotic, emotional broadcast was a virus in its perfect system. The crack began to seal, not neatly but violently. It folded in on itself, reality stitching itself back together with a sound like tearing fabric on a cosmic scale. The chittering rose to a final, deafening shriek of what sounded like agony, and then stopped. The clearing convulsed. The trees snapped back to their natural, upright positions with a sound like 1,000 breaking bones. The gray fungus withered in an instant, turning to a fine black dust. The invisible geometric patterns of heat vanished. The silence returned, but it was the old silence, the familiar, earthly quiet of a winter forest. The crack was gone. Dr. Kaito lay on the ground, unconscious. Mr. Mizushima collapsed into Hinata's arms, his form solid again, his breathing deep and regular. Haruto lowered the flare gun, his arm trembling. Yumi stared at the now silent generator, her expression one of utter disbelief. Kenji looked down at the torn, crumpled pages in his hand. Ren Mizushima's final, desperate words had become their final, desperate weapon. His sorrow had, in the end, saved them all. They had not defeated the entity. They had simply proven to be fundamentally, hopelessly incompatible. They had shown it the illogical chaos of the human soul, and it had recoiled in horror, slamming the door shut. Kenji stood up, looking at his small, exhausted team. They had survived. They had pushed back another darkness. He knew this would not be the last. The forest was a scar, and the world was full of things that liked to pick at scars. But they would be here, ready. He looked at Haruto, at Yumi, at Hinata cradling her father. They were no longer just rangers. They were the unofficial, unacknowledged keepers of the scar, and their watch had just been renewed. The end.